While the maids were forcibly holding the young girl, Grazia poured some kind of potion into her mouth. The girl tried not to drink it, but she simply had no other choice at that time. The red-haired beauty said that she should consider it an honor to die instead of Gracia. She hoped that the girl had fully enjoyed the luxurious life in the last months that Gracia had arranged for her. The girl wanted to deny something, but when she opened her mouth, she realized that the ability to speak had been lost. She realized that this must be the result of the potion she had recently been given. The girl sat silently and just watched as the maids skillfully dyed her hair red. Tears flowed down the cheeks of the poor woman. When everything was ready, Gracia even clapped her hands with joy. They were like 2 drops of water. She did not even think that one day she would thank her father for being close to that woman. But the ceremony did not force itself to wait, so it was already time to go. Gracia maliciously whispered through her teeth that she hoped the meeting with the god of the sun would be unforgettable and that she was also glad to meet them. The broken and despairing girl with red hair wanted to answer something, but could not. So only tears could tell about her state of mind at that moment. The servant forcefully dragged the girl out of the room. On the way, she could only say in her mind that she could neither speak nor control her body, so the girl doomed to lie further. Here they were already approaching the arena, which was filled to overflowing with people. Of course, no one wanted to miss such a sight. Only the thought that she did not want to die pulsated in her head. Napaz shouted as if obsessed. They were expecting an incredible sight. The high priest of the Helladius Empire, Unicus Mundus, loudly announced to all present that today, as he had promised, he would sacrifice his first daughter to the gods. He kept all his promises as if it didn't hurt him. When he delivered the speech, a tear appeared in his eyes, but the decision was already finally made. Unicus Mundus looked into the eyes of his eldest daughter. Their eyes met. Tears welled up in her eyes, but the daughter was silent. As he was not in pain at that moment, he only mentally said goodbye to Grace and continued the ceremony. The girl's eyes only begged for mercy, but she could not say anything. In her head, she was screaming that she is not Gracia, she is Rodiana. But it was already late. No one heard her. Her body was already firmly tied to a pillar in the town square. When the place for the sacrifice was set on fire, the only thought that pulsated in her head was that she did not want to die and wanted someone to save her. A sacred temple was located on the eastern edge of the empire. It was a place where stone mountains met blue skies. In the temple, a black panther lay majestically on the floor near the throne. She was waiting for orders from her master. Gino's loyal servant flew to the throne room and told his master that the solar festival had almost begun, and His Highness would take his head off if Horatio did not appear there again. On the throne, Horatio Lumen, the 3rd son of the sun god, hurriedly finished another glass of wine. But Horatius calmly replied that the servant should not worry, because he would kill him before his father. Gino replied that although he has the ability to regenerate, it is still not a pleasant event. But the solar eclipse was not reversible, and the sun festival was about to start very soon. The god of the sun, the ruler of the Povius Empire, had 3 sons. During a solar eclipse, the vassal state of Elodie must make a sacrifice to each of the princes. The most beautiful virgin girls are chosen as victims. There is a belief in Povius that the prince of the solar empire will one day meet a girl who will not be vulnerable to flames, and the result of their union will be an almighty deity. Because of this silly tale, every year the princes of Povius are forced to listen to the screams of beautiful girls while they burn alive on the day of the solar eclipse. Every time during the sun festival, Prince Horatio is amazed that people can shout so loudly. He did not ask for and did not want such sacrifices on this day. Gino pushed the prince to make a decision. He gave the iron argument that His Highness required a personal meeting if the prince refused the sacrifice, and besides, he himself would be thrown into the abyss. Gino's words made Prince Horatio rise from his throne, even though he really didn't want to. When the prince reached the exit, he ordered a servant to tell his father that today he would accept a sacrifice at the sun festival. And finally, Horatio added that Gino should tell his father that today would be the first and last time. Gino's servant really wanted to see the sacrifice with his own eyes, so he shouted from the balcony for the prince to take him with him. But the young prince was no longer in the mood for an intrusive servant. Another victim of stupid superstitions was waiting for him. When Horatio found himself in the sky in front of the sacrificial square, the fire was already in full swing. When he saw the girl, who was wrapped in flames and tied to a pillar, his head was filled with hundreds of thoughts of the crowd. Poor thing. Rest in peace, Gracia. She was so beautiful. Horatio once again regretted that he could read other people's thoughts. The people saw that Prince Horatio appeared, so they began to rejoice at his appearance and praise their god. Horatio noted in his mind that he should have appeared after the burning. Prince Horatio was told that he should lead the ceremony, so there was no need to wait. Horatio stepped into the square and went to the girl in the fire. When Horatio was quite near, he asked if her name was Grazia. Then he said that she must have some divine power if she is still alive, and added that he never wanted to accept a sacrifice. That girl only silently looked into the eyes of her executioner. Only tears flowed down the young girl's cheeks in rivers. But the prince could read minds, so he began to understand what she had to say to him, and the girl just silently shouted to the prince that she was not Gracia, and it should not bother the heartless animal in front of her at all. Gino's servant was simply maddened with rage. He couldn't even imagine how Horatio dared to bring a human sacrifice to their palace. But Prince Horatio did not pay attention to the grumbling of his servant. He calmly told him to do everything possible for the girl to survive, because the prince had to check something. But Gina could not understand why he should waste his divine powers on a miserable person. He tried to warn Horatio that he had gone against his father's will, which was serious enough. Horatio only asked if the violator could really be tried for violating the will of the sun god. And the Gino confirmed the assumption. An angry Horatio shouted that no one in the world can judge Horatio because he is the rider of justice in the heavenly palace. And this ban also applies to Sol Lumen, god of the sun and father of Horatio. Frightened, Gino decided that he would not be able to argue with Prince Horatio today, so he decided to examine the girl's body. When Gino saw what he would have to work with, he broke out in a cold sweat, because the girl had almost turned into ashes. One could not even look at the girl's charred body without disgust. But Gino was not one to be timid, so he began to cast magical spells. A few minutes later, the girl's body was without any traces of recent burns. A pretty young girl with fair hair was lying on the bed. After the hard work of restoring the charred human body, Gino breathed a sigh of relief. He told the owner that it would take some time for the girl to come to her senses. Gino warned Horatio to get rid of the human body as soon as possible, so that the stench of the human body would not spread to the heavenly palace. But their conversation was interrupted by the news that an ambassador from the emperor's palace had visited them. Horatio mentally noted that he could not bear to be interrupted, and Gino immediately ran to hide the girl. When the ambassador entered the hall, he announced that Her Highness was happy to hear that Horatio had attended his first festival and had given some gifts on the occasion. But Horatio did not want to hear about gifts. He abruptly stood up from his throne and ordered them to get out of here immediately. After such words, the ambassador of Her Highness was simply stunned. He has never been treated like this during his tenure in this position. The ambassador tried to justify himself. He reminded that he is the ambassador of Her Highness, and no one has the right to treat him like that. He came here to show respect. This is the law and traditions of the gods. But Horatio seriously noted that today is simply an incredibly wonderful day, so if the ambassador does not get out of here, then this day will be his last. The ambassador immediately felt the colossally burning gaze of the angry Prince Horatio on him. The ambassador did not have the strength to resist the power of the piercing gaze of the young god, so he shouted to the maids to run away as quickly as possible and quickly left the palace premises. Gino, watching the ambassador and the maid quickly flee from the palace, said that Her Highness and the Piros family would not forgive such treatment of their ambassadors and would recall this insult at the right opportunity. Horatio said that he didn't care about these intrigues. He just wants to live peacefully and freely, and the imperial family should not interfere in his personal life, so let them keep all their resentments to themselves. Gino noted that of course the prince himself should decide how he should live, and when he has already attended his first festival of the sun, then it is time to think about how to become a real man. But Horatio, with just a snap of 2 fingers, made Gino's servant fly away after such words. At the end, he only added that he should notify the prince when the girl wakes up. At that time, Radiana was suffering from a terrible nightmare. In that nightmare, the girl was mercilessly grabbed by the hair and dragged into a dark room. When she fell on the floor, she asked for mercy and forgiveness. But in response, someone angrily shouted that she had no right to run away and resist. The priestess asked her guards if these were all the children they managed to catch, and received an affirmative answer. The poor girl only asked for mercy and appealed to the powerful priestess Gracia to save the girl from this mess. At that time, the priestesses reported that they managed to capture and deliver another young girl. The priestess examined the new girl, asked if her name was really Radiana, and offered the girl to rest and eat. After that, Radiana was imprisoned in the tower of the temple. There she ate, slept, and took care of herself. The girl pondered why Grazia brought so many beggars to her temple. But then Radiana concluded that the god of the sun bestows blessings only on good people. This is especially important when you are about to be burned on the altar, because she will soon be sacrificed. Radiana was very sorry for Gracia, because she was soon to be sacrificed to the sun god so that he would continue to protect people. Priestess Grace was responsible for maintaining the sacred flame. She was said to be able to light a fire with divine power. It was the first priestess of El Diego, Gracia Mundos. Radiana started her day with prayer. She sincerely thanked the sun god for allowing her to lead a worldly life. In a moment, the door to Radiana's room opened, and a maid appeared on the threshold, who announced that the girl should be taken to the high priest Eunuchus. But first, they should change the color of her hair. Radiana in her heart did not understand why it was necessary. She also liked her own color very much, but she did not dare to argue with the priestess. A few hours later, Radianu, dyed red and dressed in an elegant outfit, walked along the corridors of the temple, accompanied by maids. When the girl looked at Gracia, she realized that she was like 2 drops of water. But why the priestess needed it, Radian had no idea. Radiana walked silently behind the maids and tried not to think about such a phenomenal resemblance. When she entered the hall of the palace, the servant loudly announced that the priestess Gracia had arrived to the venerable high priest Eunuchus. In the head of the poor girl, everything was mixed up from these words. At that time, High Priest Eunuchus was washing his hands and was about to go to sleep. So he wondered what brought Grazia to him at such a late hour. Radiana was completely lost. She almost lost consciousness at that time. She didn't know what to say to High Priest Eunuchus, so she started stuttering. At that moment, the real Gracia came out from behind the column of the hall and said that she was here. She had a happy smile on her face. Radiana knelt before the dignitaries and greeted the priestess. The surprised father was stunned that he did not recognize his own daughter a moment ago. Gracia was very happy about the fact that Radiana was not recognized by her own father. She chirped merrily that she had been looking for a suitable doppelganger for a long time and had finally succeeded in doing so. When the father asked what Grazia meant and why the double, Grazia painfully grabbed Radiana's hand and showed her hand to the high priest. She pulled the poor girl's hand closer to her father and showed the mark of the Mundos family burned into her skin. She said that mother was right after all. High Priest Eunuchus suddenly remembered the distant past and thought, even then he should have killed them at the opportunity. He told Gracia out loud that it was his terrible mistake. Gracia turned to Radiana and asked what she thought of their resemblance. She also said that she heard that Radiana's mother was a priestess who served the sun god. Radiana bowed her head in shame, but Gracia continued to talk about her mother, that she had pale yellow hair and a charm that attracted men from all lands. But when the high priest was ashamed to listen to such feedback about his past love, he ordered his daughter to stop gossiping, because at the moment they should be worried about the life of Grace herself. Gracia happily announced that she had already taken care of her future, because tomorrow at the festival, Radiana should take her place on the altar. Then Radiani finally realized why they were taking such care of her all this time, why they dyed her hair. All this was so that she would die instead of the priestess Gracia. In a dream, Radiana once again experienced the recent horrors of her execution, and the last words of Gracia, who said that Radiana was born only so that she could die instead of the priestess Gracia. Dreaming, she stretched out her hand and firmly grabbed the cloak of the man who had not left her bed for a long time. It was Prince Horatio Lumen. Horatio realized that she was beginning to regain consciousness, so he took her by the waist and lifted Radiana closer to him. When the prince looked at her carefully, he concluded that she was only human, but the color of her hair resembled liquid gold. When Horatio touched her body, he realized that it was simply burning. At that time, the girl began to slowly open her eyes. Radiana saw an indistinct male silhouette in front of her, but she did not recognize who it was. So she whispered quietly, asking who it was. Horatio picked up the glass of drink and held it to the girl, whose body was burning with heat. That glass came close to the young beauty's lips, forcing her to take a sip of the liquid contained in it. A picture immediately came to Radiana's head, how 2 maidservants forcibly held her in a temple room, and a priestess forcefully poured a potion into her. Her body still perfectly remembered what happened after she drank the potion, so her lips immediately tightened, and the girl refused to drink the liquid. Then she knocked the glass out of Prince Horatio's hands, and half of the drink spilled on the floor. Horatio said that the girl needed to drink immediately, otherwise the sun would dry her body to death. But Radiana was categorical and refused to drink the liquid. Horatio insisted and persuaded her to drink the liquid for her own good. After a few minutes of struggling, Radiani still managed to knock out the glass, and almost all of the liquid spilled out. Her clothes were wet, drops of liquid running down to the bottom. But Radiana still asked not to be forced to drink the drink. Horatio was also wet, and drops were running down his torso. He told the girl that her stubbornness was cute at first, but now she was beating him up, so she better not test his patience. Then he decided to get the stupid girl drunk in another way. The prince himself took a mouthful of liquid from that goblet. Then he took her by the chin and brought her as close as possible to his mouth. When the girl opened her mouth in surprise, Horatio poured the contents of his mouth into hers with skillful movements. Stunned, Radiana obediently swallowed the liquid. At this time, the girl's vision had already returned completely, and she could see his face well. The girl immediately noticed that in front of her was a very handsome young man. When she got up the courage, the first thing she asked was who exactly was in front of her. But Horatio only replied that he was a little disappointed that this person did not remember who was in front of him. The prince came closer to the girl and said that he is a heartless animal, if you believe her own words. After being reminded of the heartless animal, an image of her recent sacrifice immediately appeared in the girl's mind as she spoke those words to the Sun Prince. Then she asked the man standing in front of her if she was really alive if she could talk to him. To which the prince replied that he would not have said that, but she did not look like a dead person either. Horatio said that this should not be forgotten, because the family of those who offended the sun god will suffer from his wrath for the next 3 generations. When the frightened girl huddled in the corner of the bed after such a prophecy, she thought to herself that she would hardly wait for her great-grandchildren. Radiana eventually regained consciousness and fell to her knees before the sun god. She apologized for her words and begged to forgive the poor girl's sins. She almost burned to death, so she had no desire to suffer forever in hell. Radiana begged to bless her with her love and protect her from eternal suffering. Horatio was tired of listening to the pleas of the young girl, so he came closer to her and took her in his arms. The Sun Prince went to the bed and carefully laid the girl on it. But as soon as Radiana's body touched the bed, she immediately lost consciousness. He could not believe that the person was so weak. Horatio stood aside and admired the beauty, who lay unconscious on the bed. The following thoughts swirled in his head. They, the sons of the sun god, must constantly supervise and lead people. The reason for this close supervision is only to make people bow down to the gods and fear their death penalty. Human life is short and worthless. But this girl was the first person who dared to look into his eyes. And there was something else that fascinated and intrigued the prince at the same time, and that was that he couldn't read her mind. Although until today, he could read the thoughts of all living beings. To himself, Horatio noted that it would be a shame to kill this girl right now, so he decided to leave her alive for the time being. While the girl lay unconscious in her bed, Horatio went to solve urgent matters. The first thing he did was to call the maid and order her to look after Radiana so that the girl would not make too much noise. Finally, he ordered the maid to treat the young girl with respect, because he needed her alive at the moment. When Gino came to Horatio's room the next morning, he was simply disturbed by such an act of his master. He asked to explain why this person is still alive. Horatio sat solemnly on his throne and stroked his panthers. He ordered the servant to be quieter. It was his decision to leave the girl alive, but the servant was worried that someone would smell her. But Horatio explained to the servant that he himself suggested that the prince quickly become a real man. So why did he now start to panic? These words made Gino's hair stand on end. He even began to doubt that his master was sane. Gino questioned whether Horatio really wanted intimacy with a human sacrifice. Then Horatio said that he was joking. Gino admitted that he believed the prince and asked when exactly he would get rid of this person. The servant hoped that the prince would not leave her as a pet. Gino gave strong arguments that they could not leave a person alive. Even if His Highness agreed to it, then Her Highness would not give it to the prince. And if Her Highness sends another ambassador, the man will die immediately, so they must kill him first. After listening to his servant, Horatio admitted that Gino was right. The servant was glad that the master finally listened to his servant and offered to finish the man immediately. But Horatio had his own thoughts on the matter. He wanted to spend the night with this beautiful girl as soon as possible. Gino covered his ears with his hands and just kept repeating that he hadn't heard anything like that. But Horatio said that Gino's insolence amazed him, and asked if Gino did not want the prince to do to him as he had done to the other fools in their kingdom. But Gino protested that this would be the extreme point of cruelty on the part of Prince Horatio. Horatio narrowed his eyes and glared at Gino. Then he said that no one would find out if the servant kept his mouth shut. But Gino really wanted to get an answer to his question: how long the prince was going to hide the human girl. Prince Horatio was very different from his own brothers. His hair and eye color indicated that he was born to a mortal woman. Since ancient times, demigods were not considered full-fledged, even if one of the parents was a supreme deity. As a punishment from God, many such people were killed or poisoned so that no one would even guess about their existence. But Horatio, despite all these obstacles, managed not only to survive, but also to become the prince of the empire. He inherited his father's fame and was born with the ability to read the minds of others. That is why no one dared to challenge him, not even the sun god Sol. But in his family, they were just waiting for him to finally become a man. But Gino objected to such a statement of the prince. Although his family was waiting for him to become a man, no one wanted a human to be his partner. For such a title, they can be deprived. But Horatio continued calmly stroking his cat, which only purred in response. Gino asked if this is Horatio and is trying to strip him of his title. To become a prince after coming of age, the heir must marry a representative of a noble family or a high nymph and consummate the marriage, one who supported the empress and the nobles, and compiled a list of potential brides for Prince Horatio to control. But Horatio wished to renounce his rights to the throne and enter into an alliance with a man. Gino racked his brains a little and came to the conclusion that even if something happens between them, Horatio is the only judge of heaven. Emperor Sol will not be able to take the title of prince from him. Gino still insisted on his point. Horatio should not get close to a person because it is not right. But Horatio exhaled and said doomedly that he agreed to everything if only the family would stay behind him. The loyal servant warned his master that he could be expelled from heaven for such an act. But Horatio poured himself a full glass of wine and said that this was exactly what he desired most. Radiana woke up to the fact that she began to feel the warmth of the sun. When she opened her eyes, she asked herself if it was a dream, or if God had looked down on her and sent her to heaven. Then she turned her attention to her hands. They were tightly bound. Looking up, the girl noticed Horatio sitting next to her on the bed. The prince asked what her name was, since she was not Gracia, and the girl said that her name was Radiana. The sun god repeated this name, Radiana. The young man liked it. Then the young man introduced himself and said that Radiana could call him Horatio. The young girl asked not to kill her and to untie her hands. Horatio, of course, said that he would not kill the girl if she promised him not to pass out anytime soon. When he untied the girl's hands, she stood up and immediately bowed before God. Horatio took Radiana by the chin and gently lifted her head. He said that there is no need to do this and that you should raise your head. He asked to look into his eyes, and Radiana fulfilled his request. When their eyes met, he said to maintain eye contact during the conversation. Horatio gave the young girl a pleased smile. Radiana was once again convinced that the young man was surprisingly attractive. Horatio continued the conversation and told Radiana that he had decided to give her life. Surprised, the girl asked if Horatio really had mercy on her, and the young man assured that of course he would pardon her and even make her immortal, but in return, she should spend one night with him in his bed. Radiana turned away from the young man in fear. She did not want to agree to this. He offered very strict conditions. She said she doesn't want to be immortal. Then Horatio noted that Radiana was very brave. Once she dared to refuse the sun god. Horatio got out of bed and, leaving the girl's room, told her to rest well and gather strength, because she was weaker than a mouse at the moment. When the door to the room closed, the girl sat on her bed in shock and began to think about everything. She immediately remembered the words of her own mother, who constantly told her to protect her innocence at all costs. Tears appeared in her eyes. She was confused and scared. There were only thoughts in his head that although he is God, he remains a man first and foremost. Of course, his words were as sweet as honey, but he would immediately turn the girl into a tree or a stone if she could not please the young man. The girl was distracted from her heavy thoughts by a sweet aroma that resembled the smell of flowers. When the girl turned her head, she saw a female creature appear in the room, from which this pleasant aroma came. Radiana was not ready to see anyone but Horatio in her room, so she screamed loudly in fear. That creature calmed the young girl down and asked her not to make a fuss in the heavenly palace. The young girl greeted Radiana. It was Nika, the lowest water nymph. There were 19 children younger than her in her family. Nika came closer to her mistress's bed and said that she had brought her some water. It would be an honor for a nymph to serve as His Highness's first partner. But there was one but. Radiana completely refused water and food. It is a well-known fact that mortals cannot live in the heavenly palace for a long time. The fragile bodies of mortals wither. They cannot withstand the excessive heat of the sun, so in order to survive, they definitely need food and drink. Nika sat down on the edge of the bed next to her mistress and said that Radiani needed a drink. The nymph placed a glass of water in Radiana's hands and said that it contained the spiritual energy of the third sun prince. The nymph did not understand how it was possible to refuse such a treasure. After all, the holy water, imbued with the energy of Prince Horatio, was considered the most important value among the nymphs of the Tezca Palace. Radiana sadly asked what would happen if she drank this water, and the nymph explained that the hostess would become healthy and beautiful, like the goddess of the Povius Empire. Radiana offered Nice to drink the contents of the cup herself, but the nymph did not even dare to think about the fact that His Highness was a gift from Lady Radiana. Then Radiana, in order not to upset Nika, drank that holy water, and the nymph happily offered to start eating from tomorrow. But Radiana just shook her head. She was not going to eat. Well, then the nymph at least offered to drink water so that Radiana would not refuse water. The nymph thanked Radiana for agreeing to drink water and sat down closer to offer to weave into a braid of fragrant flowers. As the beautiful Radiana sat with a glass of holy water in the middle of her room, the nymph skillfully wove beautiful flowers into her hair. From that look, Radiana played with new colors. Satisfied, Nika informed her mistress that in heaven the girl weaves flowers into her hair as she prepares for her wedding night. After these words, Radian drank a glass of water from his hands. An angry Horatio sat on a throne in the middle of his palace. He was in a bad mood. A worried maid appeared before him and informed His Highness that Lady Radiana had agreed to drink the holy water today. An angry Horatio shouted that if she was only here for this message, then she should go to hell. And the nymph instantly turned into drops of water and disappeared. The human woman who had so intrigued Horatio had been refusing food for several days in a row. She drank only holy water. It was clear to everyone that she would have died on the first day if the skilled healer Gino had not been nearby. Horatio knew that Gino was somewhere nearby, so he ordered him to show himself immediately if his own life was dear to him. Gino jumped up in the middle of the hall in fright, raised his hands, and shouted that he was just passing by. Horatio wondered why Gino was passing by just when the prince was ordering those who deserved it here. Gino began to sharpen his again. He asked if the prince had changed his mind about leaving the human girl alive. And Horatio exhaled heavily. He was already starting to get annoyed by these chatter. But Gino continued. He said that sharing golden water with a human girl was not a smart decision, so the prince should think it over. Horatio sat with a glass of holy water in his hands. He was already annoyed enough by these constant claims from Gino. His patience had already kicked in. Horatio decided to teach the annoying servant a lesson and began to burn his soul with his watchful gaze. The same one immediately began clamoring to be spared, because his life was almost taken away. Horatio took pity on his servant and stopped his gaze. Gino let out a sigh of relief. Then Horatio said that this girl could look him straight in the eye. But Gino stood his ground. They should get rid of the human girl soon. But when it reached him what exactly the host had said, his eyes widened in surprise. Can a human girl who looked directly into the eyes of the sun god survive? Can a human soul survive after such a thing? Asked the servant. That is why Horatio left her alive. That's why Horatio wanted to save the girl's life, even if the food had to be forced. Something worried Horatio, and he immediately disappeared from the hall. Only an overturned glass on the floor reminded him of him. At that time, Radiana went to the roof of the heavenly palace. Only one thought pulsated in her head. Why did she ask the sun god for mercy? She was also disturbed by the aroma of these flowers, which reminded the girl of the purpose of which she had woven them into her hair today. Radiana went to the very edge of the roof. She knew that Nika had already left, and the other servants had nothing to do with her. So right now, no one can stop her. This was her only chance. When she looked down, her heart almost stopped from fear. But she didn't want to live anymore. There were many difficulties in her life. But when they surrounded her, Radiana raised her eyes and looked at the shining sun. It was the sun that gave her life. It was exactly the reason that made her fight on. She constantly dreamed of inhaling the aroma of flowers and looking at the sunny sky. But reality turned out to be completely opposite to her imagination. Radiana admitted to herself that she was always a hypocrite. Her life was always unhappy, but she could not give up. There was a nagging thought in her head that maybe it would be better to die than to be stuck forever waiting for the future. Radiana took a step and flew down. Already, when her whole life flashed before her eyes, and she had already said goodbye to her own life, someone took her tightly in his arms. Radiana looked up and saw that she had been saved by the sun god Horatio. He told her with a smile on his face that it was all a waste of time. Horatio explained to Radiana that even if she fell and died, he would still bring her back to life. So you don't need to do this in the future. He carefully placed her on the bed and told her that resurrection is a rather painful process, so you shouldn't try it on yourself. Then Prince Horatio took the most delicious fruit from the table. The girl held out her hands, which were trembling from fear and excitement. In an instant, the fruit was in her hands. In her mind, she said that now she would not even be able to die. Radiana looked at the juicy fruit and realized that now she doesn't even have the right to decide anything on her own, so she just needs to accept it and somehow continue to exist. Horatio said that he understood that the water nymph was not around when all this happened. Otherwise, he would simply cut off his head. After these words, he offered Radiana some food. If this does not happen, Nika will have a sad end. From that day on, Radiana was watched over by more servants. Every morning, Nika offered food to her mistress, and the girl, through force, ate the food for the safety of her nymph. Despite the fact that Radiana had no desire to eat or drink, that holy water and food did their job, and Radiana finally recovered. Horatio began to visit Radiana more and more often without warning. Every time at the sight of Prince Nick, she turned into a drop of water and instantly disappeared. Radiana endured Horatio's dry smiles and short conversations with him until it was bedtime. Horatio tried to enjoy their brief and meager communication as much as possible. For 2 centuries, he hardly communicated with anyone, and it was all because of a cursed blessing. Everyone who looked into the eyes of the sun god immediately died. But Radiana was different from other people. Although she was afraid of the prince, her soul did not suffer. Besides, Horatio couldn't read her mind, so he enjoyed the silence between them. He let Radiana cry. Horatio knew he could resurrect Radiana again and again if she chose to commit suicide. Sometimes he even thought about sharing immortality with her. There was only one problem that puzzled Horatio, and that was Radiana's lack of stamina. Horatio looked into his Radian's eyes and reminded him that it was time to sleep. The girl agreed. This was the only thing that Radiana did not like. They did not understand how she should fall asleep when she did not want to do it at all. Radiana always wondered why the sun god saved her life. Radiana kept thinking that doing nothing all day, and then forcing herself to sleep was very difficult. Nika was here like here. She told the hostess that Horatio had gone hunting. The maid asked if she should prepare a bath for Radiana, if she might want to have breakfast. Horatio insisted that Radiana sleep as long as possible. He repeated that only she managed to survive in the heavenly palace, and only holy water gave the girl some cheerfulness. Constantly sleepy, Radiana told Nikki that she wasn't feeling well. She asked the maid if there was any work she could attend to. Nika asked if Radiana was bored. They could sing or dance right now to comfort Radiana somehow. But Radiana explained that she needed a job. Any work, cleaning, cooking, washing fruit. She agreed to everything. The nymph explained that members of the imperial family did not work, so it was out of the question. But Radiana denied that she was not from their family. But Nika quietly said that Radiana is His Highness's partner, so she is equal to a member of the imperial family. After these words, the nymph only screamed and turned into a drop of water. Such a momentary disappearance of the maid was always caused by one reason, the appearance of Prince Horatio nearby. Yes. Horatio appeared in Radiana's room and asked how long she had been awake. The young girl mentally noted that the prince liked it when she somehow reacted to his words. So this time, Radiana began to smile back. But Horatio noticed that something was bothering the young girl. Therefore, he came closer to her and asked what exactly caused her such a mood. The girl replied that nothing bothers her. Then Horatio bent over Radiana and said that he hated liars. Radiana explained to the prince that the reason for her bad mood was the lack of any work. She could do different jobs. The girl asked to entrust her with something. She assured me that she had very good hands, so she could do anything, even weaving baskets or boxes out of papyrus. But the young man leaned closer, took her chin in his hands, and whispered that she didn't need to do anything with any papyrus. He could give her anything she wanted, so her only job was to stay in the heavenly palace. Radiana once again noticed for herself that sometimes his look was full of cruelty, madness, and boundless sadness. He said to wait for him like a beautiful statue. This is what he will have for her. This is all he demands from Radiana. Then they turned their gazes simultaneously in one direction. There, his beloved panther was approaching them. When the wild cat came closer to Horatio, he gently stroked her and told her that they both didn't need to find any meaning in their existence. They were both his property, and it was for this reason that they both existed in this world so far. Prince Horatio had not been in a good mood these past few days. Everyone around noticed this. Gino also worried about his master, and also wondered why he was in such a bad mood when he got what he wanted. He could not understand His Highness at all. While walking through the heavenly palace, Gina noticed a nymph collecting papyrus. This greatly interested the servant, so he stopped and decided to find out in more detail why she needed him. Gino approached the nymph and asked how the man was doing. Nika came back and said that he scared her. She asked if his question was about Lady Radiana's health. The nymph assured the servant that everything was perfectly fine with Lady Radiana. Then Gino added that, in principle, everything could not be right with a person who is in the heavenly palace. Then the nymph agreed that perhaps everything was not well with Lady Radiana. Gino wondered if Radiana herself told her that everything was not okay, or if it was Nika who drew such conclusions herself. And he also wanted to find out more specifically what exactly makes a person unhappy. At the time when Nika collected her thoughts and thought about sharing her experiences with Gino, Prince Horatio approached her from behind. He asked if her name was really Nika. The nymph almost lost consciousness from surprise and fear. She frankly admitted to the prince that her heart almost stopped. Horatio then told Nikki that this is completely insolent and that she does not value her life at all. That girl said that she had no idea what exactly His Highness was talking about. Horatio said that she had used rhinum before their meeting, and that was why she could not think of Radiana, which was already an unheard of audacity. Rhinum is a shield for the mind, which is created from sulfur, gold, and ancient magic. Rhinum allows you to temporarily hide your thoughts from Horatio's eavesdropping hearing, as well as protect your soul from the prince's gaze. Excited and frightened, the nymph explained that she had no choice. She was worried that Horatio would worry about Lady Radiana. Horatio was not in a good mood before, so this nymph added fuel to the fire. He asked how she even dared to say such a thing. Horatio began to consider what he should do with this nymph. At first he decided to kill her for such a concession, but then he thought that Radiana would lose consciousness again when she found out about it. Now Horatio finally understood why he had been angry the last few days. The reason for his bad mood was the golden-haired beauty. But Horatio is not used to hearing rejections, so if he has already decided to learn the truth, he will learn it at any cost. He took out a magic powder and blew it over the nymphs' heads. Now he could clearly read all the nymphs' thoughts, and she, in turn, sympathized with Radiani. The nymph was worried that the girl could jump off the balcony. Nikki felt sorry for Radian when she forced herself to eat, even when she was sick of eating. Radiana could not even leave the palace because His Highness blocked all the exits. Nika was eager to help Radiana, but Gino's valet warned that Horatio would burn down her house if she angered him. Lady Radiana was unhappy. She was afraid of the third sun prince and forced herself to smile. This is what Horatio read in the nymph's mind, after which she fell to the floor of the heavenly palace. Gino also asked Horatio that this must have been the reason why they had had such bad weather all month. It was all because of that person who got on the prince's nerves. After thinking for a moment, Horatio ordered to erase all the memories of the nymph and bring more papyrus. When Gino asked why they needed the papyrus, His Highness explained that he should give it to the human girl. Gino asked the owner why he was messing around with this girl and said that his family was wondering if he had spent the night with someone. So Gino was torn between two fires and did not know what to say or to whom. Horatio suggested that Gino visit the imperial palace tomorrow. Confused, the servant asked why he needed it, and Horatio, with a smile on his face, explained that a visit to the imperial palace was necessary in order to show evidence that the prince had intimacy. Sad Radiana was in her room as usual. She was forbidden to walk around the heavenly palace, so this is almost the only place where she always spent her time. Out of the corner of her eye, she glanced at the maids who were constantly watching the girl. She caught herself thinking that one day she would become just like them, a soulless doll. Such thoughts were regularly in Radiana's head when she just sat and watched from the balcony of her own room. Radiana struggled with hunger all her life. Her desire was to take at least a sip of water. She almost lost her mind when she ate just one herb. But now everything is completely the opposite. Her life turned 180 degrees. Now Radiana has a soft bed, the most delicious food and drinks. But only one question remained in her head. Why is she looking for a reason to live? The only thing Radiani lacked was will. She didn't want to just live, she needed freedom. In childhood, the mother gave the girl false hope, and Radiana was offended by her for this. The mother said that one day Radiana would be free, and even after death, the mother would pray for that. The mother hoped that her daughter would experience all the joys that were in her mother's life. The mother hoped that her daughter would become a beacon in the darkness. Radiana had bitter tears. She only now understood the whole essence of her mother's words and realized how wrong she was to think like that. Radiana was distracted from her heavy thoughts by the voice of her beloved servant. She showed her mistress a large pile of papyrus. The pleased nymph told Radiana that she had brought something for her. Radiana was both happy and scared at the same time, because if His Highness finds out about it, you won't envy them both. But Radiana did not have time to tell what the prince would do with them, how he would find out about it, when she heard his familiar voice from behind, which said that the nymph had his permission for this. Horatio, with a smile on his face, told Radiana that she herself wanted the papyrus, so here is the papyrus for her. Radiana was very surprised, because until very recently he categorically refused to fulfill her request. His Highness held out his hand to Radiani, and she took hers in return. She felt the warmth of his hand, and her soul felt more comfortable. So, holding hands, they walked closer to the papyrus through the entire hall of the heavenly palace. Radiana's heart began to beat wildly, and as she did not calm him down, he did not listen to her reason. When she went to the papyrus and examined the pile, she mentally noted that there was too much of it. In front of the girl was a whole mountain of papyrus. She wanted to ask why so many, but did not dare. Horatio, without letting go of her hand, looked directly into her eyes and asked how she felt now. Radiana was confused. She did not expect such a direct question, so she did not know exactly what to answer His Highness. Then she withdrew her hand and bowed. With her head down, she said she was very grateful to His Highness. When she raised her eyes, she saw from the expression on Horatio's face that he was not expecting such an answer from the girl. So she was at a loss and began to think of what else she should have said. Horatio came close to the girl and took her face in his hand. He said that she should smile when she says words of gratitude. An insincere, tortured smile appeared on Radiana's face. She could not refuse to fulfill the request of the sun god, although she did not want to smile at all. Horatio also understood that the girl's smile was not sincere, and he also became upset. Radiana began to tremble with fear. She understood that Horatio's mood was beginning to deteriorate. He asked the girl why she claimed that she wanted to live, although in reality it was not visible. His Highness explained that it is customary for those who want to live to constantly pray to the gods for this. At the same time, the girl fell to her knees in front of Horatio. Her body was shaking, and she couldn't do anything about it. Radiana bowed her head to the floor and began to beg the sun god. Horatio expected to hear that the girl would plead for longevity or even immortality, but Radiana looked up and said clearly that she only asked him for one thing, that he kill her as soon as possible. Horatio raised his eyebrows in surprise and asked if the girl really wanted to die. And this was after all this effort to please Radiani. Horatio reached out and lifted Radiana off the floor. He saw that she was just shining, and it was precisely at the time when the girl was between life and death. Horatio picked up the beauty and carefully placed her on the papyrus pillow. Then he leaned over the confused girl and said that I appreciate good manners, because he is, after all, a sunny prince. The girl, as if hypnotized, lay on the papyrus and did not take her eyes off Horatio. Meanwhile, he slowly untangled her braids, playing with the beauty's golden hair. The girl was afraid that something indecent might happen now, so she tried to stop Prince Horatio. She told him to stop. She claimed that he was kind and polite. Horatio even smiled. It was funny for him to hear such flattery from her, so he asked if she really believed what she said. Horatio leaned down and whispered in her ear to ask her to kill herself again. If she does that, he'll take her right here. He knew it would be a more painful experience than death. The Sun Prince then gently took her chin and told her she could beg him for mercy. After Radiana had to ask him to give her life, he would try to keep her and make her his forever. When he leaned down and touched his lips to her forehead, he could almost feel her thoughts. He knew that if she really wanted to die, she wouldn't waste time thinking about it. After a moment, his lips fell below the girl's forehead. They met her lips and touched them gently. She did not resist such a passionate kiss. Her fingers intertwined with his, and she tightened her grip on his hand. After the kiss, Radiana felt her whole body burning, as if she was on fire again. Her gaze met His Highness's passionate gaze. Horatio took her hand and said that it was enough for today. Her body had to get stronger to match his body. He then brought her hand to his mouth and bit her finger. Radiana cried out in pain and surprise. He gently looked straight into her eyes, and she understood that it was necessary. Blood began to drip from her finger. She dripped faster and faster. But Radiana did not feel pain. She didn't even dare to move. Horatio placed a handkerchief under Radiana's wounded finger. When the handkerchief was sufficiently soaked with blood, the prince handed it to the maid and ordered Gino to give it to his father. Then he gently kissed her injured finger and told Radiana to rest. The bleeding stopped immediately. After a moment, Horatio disappeared from her room, and the girl was left lying in a pile of papyrus. She still could not recover from the recent events. Her heart wanted to jump out of her chest. Then the girl began to come to her senses and understand that all the servants were in the room at that time. So they were all witnesses of what just happened here. Radiana almost burned with shame. She immediately thought of Nika. If the nymph also saw all this, then how could Radiana look into her eyes? But Radiana did not have time to remember her nymph, as she immediately appeared in the room. Nika apologized that she had to disappear from the room. When Horatio suddenly appeared, she immediately disappeared. The nymph asked if the mistress was all right, and Radiana breathed a sigh of relief that Nika did not see the shame that happened here a few minutes ago. Gino walked slowly to the heavenly palace. Behind him, a servant was carrying a chest with some things. Gino said to himself that he knew this day would come someday. At the gates of the palace, the valet Gino greeted Solo Lumen, the almighty son of the sun. He stated that he had come here from Horatio Lumina and humbly asked for an audience. In the main hall of the heavenly palace, Solo Lumen sat reverently on the throne. On both sides of him were servants and representatives of noble families. The valet Gino bowed before the sun god and expressed his respect for him. Solo Lumen said loudly that he hoped Gino had come here with good news. The valet began mumbling something inaudibly and could not clearly explain why he had come here. The wise god Solo realized that they didn't need extra ears for this confidential conversation and raised his right hand. Without a word, his servants understood that they had to leave the premises of the hall and immediately rushed to carry out the order of the sun god. Then the valet told what exactly brought him to the palace to Solo Lumen. Solo Lumen listened carefully and asked Gino who exactly that girl was. Gino had drops of cold sweat on his forehead after his question. He narrowed his eyes and announced with fear that this girl was a human. Solo Lumen asked if Horatio took the victim with him. Perhaps it was a priestess with special abilities, about which their ancient prophecy speaks. But Gino just guiltily said that Solo Lumen is wrong. This girl that Horatio chose has nothing to do with the prophecy. Her divine powers are too small. Gino got ahead of Solo's thoughts and asked if God didn't think His Highness Horatio wanted to rebel against his father. But Solo Lumen calmed Gino down. He said that Horatio was very close to him despite his brashness. Then the clever Solo asked Gino to make everyone think that this girl was a courtesan of the imperial court. Gino's eyes widened at such a request. But Solo explained that Horatio would be appearing with this girl at the imperial palace anyway, so it would be better for everyone to think she was a courtesan. Gino agreed that this would be the best solution for everyone. Solo then continued that as soon as Horatio got sick of that girl, they would get rid of her right away. With a flick of his finger, Solo Lumen sealed the contents of the box that Gino's valet had brought him and said that it would be in that condition because Solo Lumen did not want to fight with his third son. A week after the events in the imperial palace, Radiana woke up in her bed. She looked around for her maid. The nymph Nika immediately appeared and greeted her mistress. She was very worried about Radiana because the girl slept for a whole week. But Radiana assured her servant that she was in complete order. By the way, Radiana wanted to share one more piece of news with her nymph. The girl extended her right hand to the maid and showed her forearm. Radiana explained that she had lost the stigma of a white slave, and besides, the skin became several times whiter and smoother. She was grateful to His Highness for finally giving them the right to choose, which they had never had before. Radiana pondered why he had given her the right to choose and spared her life. Radian also had one more request. She cheerfully told the maid that she was very hungry, so she asked the nymph to bring her breakfast. The nymph did not even dream of hearing such words from her mistress. So she said that of course she would immediately bring the most delicious breakfast for Radiana. Radiana got up from the bed and stretched sweetly. Today, she felt much better than before. She thought to herself that it was just one kiss, and she seemed to have aged a few years. Radiana decided to share with the nymph that on Earth she was not a priestess, but an ordinary slave, and this stigma was proof that her social position was quite low. But after the kiss, it seemed to Radiani that her life was fleeting, just like the stigma that disappeared from her skin in an instant. But the nymph told Radiana not to say such things about her life. After all, in the heavenly palace, everyone, except the gods, has an equal social position. But Radiana's past is irrelevant. In addition, Nika added that Prince Horatio chose Radiana as his partner, so everyone will have to respect Radiana. Nika also said that Radiana is the first lady a nymph serves, so she is special to Nika, and the nymph is very happy to help Radiana. Radiana laughed cheerfully in response. They were very pleased to hear such words. The girl had never felt such warmth before, and this warmth began to melt little by little her steel determination. Over the past few days, so many new feelings and thoughts have accumulated that Radiana decided to go out on the balcony to calmly think about everything. The girl looked at the sky and thought that this might be the last time she was so lucky. She remembered Horatio's words that she needed to become stronger to be on the same level as the prince, and if her life depended on Horatio's will, then she must do what he asks. So Radiana went to the papyrus, which lay in a heap in the middle of her room. She asked Nick to bring a knife and a hammer. From today, she decided to do everything possible for this. When His Highness and his valet entered the room, they remained standing in the doorway. They were very surprised by what they saw. Papyrus branches were spread out on the floor, and the nymph and Radiana were persistently arguing by his side. The nymph was the first to hear that guests had entered the room, so she turned her head and let out a cry of surprise. Nika got up from the floor and bowed her head to the Sun Prince. She greeted the distinguished guests and humbly waited for further orders. Horatio asked what it all meant, and Nika explained that she was helping Lady Radiani tear the leaves from the papyrus trunk. His Highness turned his gaze to the golden-haired girl. She was completely focused on weaving baskets, so she did not pay attention to those present and continued to work. Nika said that as soon as Lady Radiana regained consciousness, she immediately began weaving baskets. The nymph asked the girl to rest, but it was all in vain. She did not want to listen to her servant. The valet started rehearsing that this was some kind of unheard-of mess. He could not even imagine how he could transform this stubborn woman into an elegant nymph. Horatio got tired of hearing his valet whine, so he just taped his mouth shut. Then he turned his gaze to the beauty and thought that it is not worth wasting the rest of her strength on such a pointless activity. His Highness approached the girl and called her. She finally turned her head and noticed the men present. He greeted Radiana, and she happily greeted him as well. He asked if she recognized who was in front of her, and the girl answered that of course it was. Standing before her was the third son of the sun god of the heavenly palace, who appreciates good manners. Radiana explained to His Highness that she was working on his commission as he requested. Horatio was surprised by her explanation. After all, as far as he remembered, he did not give her any errands. Radiana recalled how they had talked about regaining strength, and she had told him that she had skillful hands and could weave strong baskets. And after their conversation, Horatio himself asked the girl to do whatever she wanted. Horatio thought and began to recall their conversation. He really said that to the girl, but he meant something completely different. Then the young man held out his hands to her and asked to show her. Puzzled, Radiana handed the prince her best basket and waited for a positive response. She made a lot of effort to get such beauty, but Horatio said he meant her to show him her hands, not the basket. And Radiana obediently placed her hard-working hands in his palms. When her hands were in his warm hands, their eyes met. Radiana blushed, because the images of their kiss appeared in her head again. Horatio remarked that she had gotten her hands dirty. They could not take their eyes off each other and stood like that in complete silence for several minutes. Only the maid's voice brought them back to reality. The nymph pointed to a valet whose mouth was plastered with something and told His Highness that there must be something wrong with Gino. Horatio remembered the valet and immediately opened his mouth. He had already forgotten about this annoying servant while he was talking to Radiana. Insulted, Gino whispered that he almost choked as he waited for the spell to be removed from him. It's good that at least Nika paid attention to him. He began to drive around the prince. While the valet drove in circles and told what he had to endure, a strong wind arose. The girls teased about such a phenomenon. Gino thanked him for the fact that now the papyrus will dry much faster. But the angry valet shouted that he would not tolerate it anymore, and now it was time to think about these stupid baskets. He had no idea how to turn Radiana into a courtesan worthy of the heavenly palace. But Radiana put the basket on her head and said that she was following the orders of the Sun Prince. This angered Gino even more, and he yelled at her to stop doing it immediately. That girl in a serious voice told Gino not to allow himself to be familiar and to call her by her name, Radiana. Gino's mouth fell open at such a statement. He came closer to His Highness and asked what had happened to her. He said that she had been sleeping all week. Horatio confirmed that this was the case. Gino also suggested that the girl might have hit her head somewhere, and Horatio also wondered what had become of modest Radiana. Horatio stood in silence and went through all the possible options in his head. He had no idea how the woman who had begged him to die a week ago could change so dramatically. The Sunny Prince wondered how it turned out that a broken and despairing girl turned out to be such an avid basket weaver. But only one thing was clear. Radiana looked incredibly happy. Radiana approached His Highness and asked if he still had an errand for Radiana, and if so, she would definitely try to fulfill it. Gino then asked loudly if Lady Radiana could play any of the musical instruments. Radiana stood with a basket in her hands and only blinked her eyes. Then Gino asked her if she could read poetry, if she knew how to dance, or if she could sing well. Radian had nothing to answer the valet's question. She had no idea what of the above she could show off, so she just listened to Gino's question in silence. The valet hit himself on the head with his hand and angrily asked what she was capable of when she couldn't even do that. Then Radiana held a pretty basket closer to the valet and said that she could skillfully weave strong baskets. Gino almost exploded with anger from such carelessness. Then he handed some manuscripts into Radiana's hands and told her to study carefully everything that was written there and no silly baskets. Upset Gino, late at night, informed Orazio that Radiana could neither sing nor dance. Therefore, it is unlikely to pass her off as a graceful nymph. He supposed that priestesses were not so elegant. Horatio told the valet that this girl was no priestess. On earth, she was a slave. This news completely knocked the ground out from under Gino's feet. He didn't even know about it. So he suggested that perhaps they should visit Mr. Magus. But Horatio said that Mr. Magus lived on a high mountain, so he would have to go up there with the girl. The valet said they had no other choice. The Imperial Festival is only a month away, so they must act now. Gino told Horatio that he would rather climb a high mountain with a girl than be struck by lightning when everyone finds out that the prince has chosen a human. Horatio said that tomorrow they would have visitors from the palace. Her Highness again sends the traitors for trial. It is for this reason that Gino and Radiana have to leave the palace early in the morning so that no one can smell Radiana. The next morning, even before sunrise, Radiana was already sitting in a comfortable carriage. She was full of positive emotions and in anticipation of fabulous adventures. It was her first walk. The carriage reached the foot of Mount Kor. Then they were forced to continue their journey on foot. Radiana enjoyed every step she took. She had been sitting in a confined space for so long that when she was here, she tried to use every opportunity. Gino was very unhappy with such a walk. He was already quite tired. Drops of sweat rolled down his face like hail. He already regretted not asking for a heavenly carriage. During the walk, Radiana remembered that Horatio had visited her in the bedroom this morning. Although she was asleep, she felt the touch of his warm fingers on her body through her sleep. She began to worry about the question why he came to her, because he disappeared without saying anything, even before she woke up. Radiana noticed that the valet was having a hard time with this walk, so she called him. When Gino stopped and asked what she needed, Radiana sat down and offered him to carry the valet on her shoulders. But the valet, as always, began to whine that he was too old for such a thing. After considering such a tempting offer, the valet nevertheless agreed to take advantage of such an opportunity and comfortably settled on the shoulders of the gentle girl. Having walked a few kilometers in this way, Gino cheerfully announced that they had almost arrived. It remains only to pass a big stone. The nymph came closer to the mistress and said that Lady Radiana had done a good deed. That girl said that it was little things. Radiana folded her arms and closed her eyes. She said that she really likes it here because you can enjoy the sound of the forest, the rustling of leaves, the singing of birds, the breath of the wind. But her relaxation was interrupted by the cry of the valet, who called the girls to follow him faster. Nika said that sometimes Gino behaves like a nasty grandfather. Then Radiana asked how old he really was. The nymph thought for a while and said that the valet was 500 years old, or even more. And the girls stopped chatting and went to catch up with the valet. When they went behind a large stone, Magus was already waiting for them. He carefully examined Radiana and said that when he heard that His Highness had chosen his companion, he thought that she would be like the nymph Aphrodite. But in fact, this companion turned out to be an ordinary person. But the valet wanted to stand up for her and said that fortunately the girl is smarter than she looks. That's why they visited him. Magus warned those present to be very careful with the satyrs they might meet, because they might simply devour them all. Frightened, Gino stammered whether Mr. Magus understood that His Highness wanted intimacy with this man. Magus reassured everyone present that he was joking, and they should just stick by his side. Then no one will dare to touch them. Frightened Gino could only reply that Mr. Magus is not very good at jokes, to put it mildly, but Mr. Magus went further and invited everyone to do the same. At last, after a long and difficult journey, they reached the house of Mr. Magus. The polite centaur said that they must be hungry from the road, so he offered them a treat. And he himself needed to return to work. As they began to eat, Radiana said that Mr. Magus was very kind. Gino objected and said that after such a difficult journey, he could offer something better than beer and venison. Nymph noted that she had heard that Mr. Magus was the wisest in their empire, so it was no wonder he had so many scrolls all over the house. Gino only replied that there was nothing impressive about it. For example, he has known all this for a long time, so he does not need those scrolls. After his words, Radiana burst out laughing. Gino asked what was the reason for her laughter, and Radiana explained that the valet is simply amazing. Gino was so pleased to hear such a compliment that his face immediately turned red. This was noticed by Nika, who asked why he was blushing. The girls looked around Mr. Magus's room. On the table were working tools and scrolls with some important documents. Radiana suggested that Mr. Magus must be very busy, and Gino angrily replied that it must be so. Finishing his mug of beer, Gino said that Magus was a rude lunatic and the main sage in Povius. Then, tired of such a long journey, Gino sat down on the floor and said that Magus was not with them now, so they could sleep peacefully. The nymph asked if Gino was joking, if he was going to spend the night here. This was not in her plans at all. Radiana reassured the nymph that everything would be fine, but before going to bed, she should prepare a more comfortable bed for them. The girl collected herbs and tried to arrange a place for them to rest. At that time, Horatio carried out another punishment of traitors. Kneeling before him was Pericles, who was his mentor and the father of his friend. It was not even believed that he had betrayed the empress. Horatio was very tired from such work. His hands were covered in blood, but his thoughts were somewhere far away. Radiana immediately appeared in his thoughts, sleeping soundly. At the same moment, he found himself next to his beauty, who was resting in the house of Mr. Magus. He looked at her tenderly and thought that she also didn't like looking into his eyes when she talked, so he wanted to rest in her arms for a moment. The most influential women of the empire gathered at the dinner table in the imperial garden. They decided to discuss the latest news during lunch. In the center of the table sat the pure-blooded and direct heir of the goddess Hera, Empress Avaricia Lumen. She must be up to date with all the latest news of the empire, so such dinners were held regularly. At the table, they discussed the latest events, and of course, the most important thing was that the third prince finally became a man. They were interested in the question of which lineage he decided to associate himself with. The women asked the empress if she knew who exactly he had chosen to take his virginity. The empress replied that the lineage didn't matter. Horatio would still marry the one they chose. She then asked Tara if she agreed with the empress's statement. Tara was her niece. The pleased niece said that everyone will learn everything at the imperial festival, and nobody cares about the opinion of His Highness. Avaricia Lumen raised her glass high and offered a drink for such a successful toast. She hoped that everyone present would join them. Everyone raised their glasses for the blessing of the first woman that Prince Horatio, the shining pearl of the Povius Empire, had chosen for himself. The women finished their drinks with pleasure. When the meal was finished, the empress rose from the table first. Then all the respectable women began to leave the dinner table. The empress and her niece were sent to the temple of Avaricia Lumen. Name of something else needed to be discussed. Therefore, she secluded herself in Avaricia's room. Tara was simply furious. She did not like at all that the Sun Prince chose for the first night not a woman from the Pyros family, but some unknown person. The niece's displeasure was interrupted by the empress, who asked her to stop her monologue. Avaricia Lumen ordered the maid to fill the glass with wine. When the empress was handed the glass, she assured her niece that she needn't worry about anything at all, because Horatio would marry her anyway. Tara listened to the Empress very attentively. She did not want to share the prince with some woman because she had already married him in her mind a long time ago. Avaricia Lumen said that Horatio was like a dog in Sol Lumen's arms right now, and she could swear that he would soon be Terry's. In the morning, when the nymph approached her mistress, she noticed that Radiana was not feeling well. Nika did not know what to do, so she looked for someone who could help her. The nymph asked the valet what they should do now, because Radiana's had a fever. Nika blamed Gino for this, because it was him that Radiana carried up the mountain on her shoulders all the way. Gino argued and assured her that it was not his fault because he had not asked her to do this. He could get out here himself without help. Mr. Magus came to this commotion, which was echoing several meters away, and asked what the matter was. The nymph asked the centaur for help because Radiana fell ill. Mr. Magus came closer to the girl and touched her forehead. She had a high fever, so Magus said it was all due to overwork. The nymph asked if he was sure of his diagnosis, and Mr. Magus said that they needed hibiscus tea with cinnamon for treatment. He will quickly put the girl on her feet. Mr. Magus said to prepare the thyme yourself. It has all the necessary ingredients for this. The centaur went to his room to get the necessary ingredients for the healing tea. He was sure that due to Radiana's caring and hardworking nature, she was born under the sign of Venus. When the potion was completely ready, Mr. Magus carefully poured it into the cup. He said he would start his lessons when the girl was better. Lady Radiana opened her eyes. She heard the sound of raindrops, so she asked if it was really raining outside. The nymph noticed that Lady Radiani was much better. So Nika inquired about the well-being of her mistress and was glad that the temperature had subsided. Radiana asked where His Highness was now, and Nika answered that Horatio was in his palace and they were now in Mr. Magus's cave. But Radiana was sure that at night she felt the presence of the Sun Prince. It was he who hugged her. It was his gentle warmth that she felt. But if the nymph claims that Horatio is in the palace at this time, then it is possible that everything was dreamed by Radiana. Although it was so realistic, as if in reality, when Radiana got out of bed, she asked Gino. And the nymph replied that she was not interested in that old woman, so she did not know where he was now. At that time, the girls heard the voice of the valet himself, who asked the nymph if she sometimes hoped that something had happened to him. Gino then handed Lady Radiani a bouquet of green grass. He said he collected it for Radiana. Radiana asked what it was, and Gino explained that he had brought her the papyrus, the very one she had asked from Horatio. The nymph said that he had better bring an apple for Radiana. It would be more useful. It was at this moment that the girls heard the voice of Mr. Magus, who asked if the ladies were awake yet. And the nymph said that she had completely forgotten that the Magus had asked her to show something interesting. So the girls went to another room where the centaur was at that time. When they went inside, they saw Magus skillfully working with silverware. After a few minutes, his skillful hands showed a cup of graceful dew. She was so beautiful that it was impossible to look away. Radian even opened his mouth in surprise. A question arose in her mind, how the Magus could create such a cup out of silver. Then Mr. Magus turned his head in Radiana's direction and asked the girl if she would like to try to create one out of silver. An angry valet shouted at the Magus that he was asking him to make Radiana a graceful nymph, not a blacksmith. But Mr. Magus explained that let everyone gossip about this beauty. The world learns about Radiana as Circe's heir. After careful training, Lady Radiana will become a craftswoman who creates incredible things from metal. Gino said irritably that he wasn't thrilled with the idea. After all, Circe was the goddess of stone, not metal. At this time, the nymph thought about his statement and asked why the stones did not please Gino. I should have kept my thoughts to myself. Mr. Magus offered Radiani to begin her studies, so he told the girl to watch closely and repeat after him. Her hands took the silver chains and exactly repeated all the movements made by the concentrated Magus. After a few minutes and skillful movements, a silver rose of incredible beauty ended up in Radiana's palms. The surprised valet and the nymph could not take their eyes off such beauty. They could only give compliments and admire such fabulous skills of the girl. The Magus was also pleased with how quickly the girl could master such a difficult skill, so he asked those present for their opinions on the matter. When the Magus heard that everyone liked their artwork, he told them that Prince Horatio was visiting him tonight, so the Magus will try his best not to disappoint the prince. These words struck Radiana the most. So Prince Horatio was here tonight after all, and the fact that he was lying next to her and she felt his warmth was not a dream. A few days later, it rained heavily. Radiana held out her hand to feel the blissful coolness. For several minutes, she just admired how the drops slowly dripped from her hand. But Gino was not so optimistic. He stood nearby and grumbled unhappily that the rain would not stop. His thoughts were not here at that moment. They were close to its owner. Magus was also concerned about his guests. He said that it would be difficult to get down the mountain in such a downpour, so he has something for the young people. He took out a box with some shining stones. As Radiana examined the strange stones, Magus explained that they were dried amber that had the ability to store heat. Finally, the Magus advised the young lady not to allow herself to be touched. Radiana thanked the Magus for his sound advice and wise counsel. The Magus added that the young lady should behave arrogantly, as they had rehearsed, so that no one would have any doubts about her parentage. He was glad to meet Radiana and wished her luck. All the way home, Gino worried about Prince Horatio. He couldn't understand why he was so sad, because he knew very well that they were going home today. The valet was lost in his heavy thoughts and walked quickly, hurrying to get to the palace as soon as possible. He only warned the girls to look under their feet because the road was slippery. Radiana was also thinking all the way how the prince's mood was related to the weather conditions. And not finding an answer, she decided that they still couldn't understand the gods. Radiana found herself thinking that she still wanted to learn more about Horatio Lumen. The only question in her mind was why he decided to make her immortal. Outside, the weather was getting worse. Thunder, lightning, downpour. Such incredible discharges made my head spin. Nika could no longer withstand such a storm. The valet felt that the prince did not know when to stop, so he decided to rush to his aid. Gino quickened his pace as much as possible. The girls almost followed him. They asked him to go slower, so Gino went quickly ahead. At last, they came to the door of Tezca's palace. The valet ordered the nymph to take Radiana to the bathhouse and put her in order, while he would visit Horatio in the meantime. When the girls were inside, you could breathe a sigh of relief. Finally, they will be able to dry and warm up. They were so lacking in warmth during the last hours of the journey. When Radiana passed by the windows, she noticed that the prince's temple could be seen from here. The young girl noticed that the prince's temple glowed in a strange, bright red color. Therefore, she decided to ask her servant whether the glow of the temple walls was somehow related to its highness. She hadn't noticed that before. That's why she got interested. But Nika replied that the young lady should not take this into account, because they often have to see such a light during the rains. The maid remarked that they had better hurry. When the valet ran to the prince's temple, he guessed by the number of pools of blood that there had been too many deaths here today. He ran around the palace looking for Prince Horatio. Gino found the unconscious guard and began to slow him down, asking where exactly his master was and what had happened here. Gino was annoyed and worried at the same time. No one answered the concerned valet, but he still ran around the palace looking for Horatio. At last, he saw Horatio Lumen lying on the floor of the temple. Gino cursed and ran quickly to the prince. Without wasting any extra time, Gino immediately set about rescuing His Highness. He knew that without his help, the prince would not come to his senses. When Horatio regained consciousness, he was glad that Gino had helped him in time. And the worried valet said that at this rate, Horatio would soon find himself in the power of the Empress. The valet did not know how to help his master, so he suggested that he visit the first prince. Gino said that he was a pure-blood prince and should know how to deal with all this. Horatio could see how Gino genuinely cared for him, but still said that their meeting with the first prince would not change anything. Prince Horatio remembered what happened here during the day and told the valet that today there was no trial and he just killed everyone who came here. The prince also added that he was a real killer, so he asked Gino when he was able to just kill him, and that was it. But the valet denied that he was not the murderer, but the all-powerful Judge Povius. Gino's butler insisted that Horatio meet Friar Saltus immediately. He drove him so that he would have time to return home by half a month. But Horatio only smiled back at him. The valet was left alone in His Highness's palace. There were pools of blood all around. The question swirled in his mind. Why does the Empress do this to Horatio? He just wants a quiet life. Radiana looked at the rain in her warm, cozy room. When she put her hand in the rain, her hand remained dry. She said that she guessed the reason for such a phenomenon. The nymph was already in a hurry to treat her mistress to delicious warm tea. She said that this palace is just full of magic, so there is nothing to be surprised about. Radiana asked the maid if she was going home because it was already too late. And the nymph explained that today there was a heavy downpour and the valet asked to stay until it subsided completely. Radiana asked that when His Highness would come to them. The young lady knew that the nymph was afraid of the prince, but Nika confidently replied that Horatio would not come today. Radiana was even upset. She did not expect such a confident statement from the maid. The tea was delicious and warm. It warmed the young girl, and she began to think about the prince. The maid understood that the lady should be left alone, so she wished good night and went to the bedroom, which was next to Radiana's room. Radiana was thinking about him. Since the rain did not stop outside, she understood that the prince was in an extremely bad mood. But one could only guess about his reasons. The girl didn't know exactly since what time, but she couldn't stop thinking about Horatio. The warmth of his touch, the spark that flew when they kissed, the weight of his body resting on top of hers was constantly in her mind. From such thoughts, Radiana spilled tea on the table when she put the cup down. Her cheeks lit up with a red blush. She herself was afraid of such a reaction to thoughts about His Highness. Radiana still couldn't help but think about Horatio. Her gaze was directed at the rain, and in her mind there was only one question when he would return to her. In the palace of Linitua, the first Prince Saltus Lumen was reading a book in the hall. Saltus suddenly felt someone's presence, but when he turned around, there was no one in the hall. But the feeling of the first prince was not easy to deceive, so he asked if it wasn't Horatio who had come to visit him, and he added that it would be possible to send a message and he would be met. Lumen did not like that his brother was sneaking up on him like a ghost. When he examined his brother from head to toe, he understood everything and only asked how many he had killed this time. Horatio bowed his head and replied that he had already lost count. His brother was surprised and said that less than 3 months had passed since the last mass execution. Lumen took his brother's hand in his and said that there was already fresh blood on his hands. He sternly asked Horatio if he had not lost his common sense because it was too dangerous. Lumen said that this time it would take more than one cleansing to wash away all that blood, so he would sprinkle the purest water into Linitua. He took his cup and proceeded to purify his brother. Horatio didn't even know if Saltus's powers would help him this time. The young man knew that there was too much blood on his hands. When Horatio closed his eyes and completely surrendered to the effect of the holy water, the first thing that came to his mind was Radiana. He scolded himself for not having anything else to think about at such a crucial moment. Saltus told his brother that although he is a judge, he should not forget that he is a sun prince, and the sons of the sun cannot grant death to those who do not deserve it. Therefore, if Horatio continues in the same spirit, he risks losing all his spiritual energy. Therefore, if he does not want to repeat the fate of Hades and end up underground, then he must stop. Saltus decided to change the topic of conversation because it was clear that the brother was not happy to listen to all this, and he asked from which family of nymphs, with whom he had intimacy, because now this is the #1 topic. The brother said that when the rumors of Horatio's first intimacy reached him, he even thought that the brother had united with Her Highness. Halibut offered his brother to accept Avaricia's offer, and then think about further actions. He believed that only in this case would he have a chance of survival, but Horatio denied that it would not save him, because that's how the Pyrrhos family will gain more influence when they ally with them. Horatio then asked permission to ask one direct question, whether he wanted Caligo to inherit the throne. Saltus thought he did not know what to answer, and Horatio, not waiting for an answer, continued. He said that when this happens, war will no longer be feared, for even a war is not needed for Povius to fall under Caligo's rule. Saltus noted that he is satisfied with Lenitua's rule, and rebellion against the father will be considered treason. That is why he advised Horatio not to waste his time trying to support him, but to think better of himself instead. But Horatio said that in any case he would repulse his father with great joy. Before Radiana had time to open her eyes in the morning, a happy valet flew into the room and shouted for her to look at the things he had managed to get for her. The sleepy young girl asked what exactly the things were in question, and Gino explained that he had managed to acquire everything on Mr. Malgus's list, so she could start practicing right now. The young girl examined all the tools and was satisfied that they were of good quality. Nevertheless, she asked the valet if he was sure that His Highness would allow this. The valet noted that she could neither sing nor dance. Therefore, she must learn to make flawless silverware. Then the valet called Nika. When the maid came closer, the valet handed her a whole bunch of poems. The valet ordered the nymph to read those poems to Lady Radiani constantly when she was busy making silverware. The valet also informed Lady Radiani that in 15 days she would be participating in the half-moon festival as a nymph. That girl denied that she was human. The valet answered that she would have to pretend, because under no circumstances should people be in the heavenly palace. And if the lie is exposed, they will all be struck by lightning. Radiana shuddered at such a message. She had no idea that everything was so serious. After thinking a little, the young girl asked the valet what would happen next. Gino did not understand what exactly the girl meant, so he asked her again. Radiana explained that she was interested in what would happen next if everyone bought into this lie, and no one could guess that she was not human. The valet said that His Highness would marry the girl his family had chosen for him, and Radiana would be free. He could not tell the girl the whole truth. She happily took his hand, and he continued in his mind that when it was all over, she would simply be burned at the stake. The valet didn't dare to say that. Radiana looked into his eyes and asked if he was telling her the truth. And the valet was confused, so he asked what exactly she meant. Radiana wondered if she would really be free when it was all over. The valet took his hand away and cleared his throat. He had to lie to the young girl again and said that until then His Highness would not need her, so she would be free. Radiana believed the valet and was glad that she had an opportunity to get free. Therefore, she sincerely promised that she would make every effort to ensure that everything was successful. It had been 10 days since Gino had brought all the instruments to Lady Radiani. She worked tirelessly every day. She wanted so much to get the cherished will. The nymph was by her side all the time, and as the valet had ordered, she kept reading poems for Radiana while she worked. This day was no exception. She asked if the lady could repeat what she remembered. Radiana said that she would be happy to repeat the poem. She thought she had managed to memorize the work of 20 scrolls. Nika wondered if the young girl could recite everything from memory, or if she would have to remind Radiana first. But Radiana closed her eyes and began to recite the poem. A smile should touch your lips as my heart freezes. Radiana held in her sleeve a flower of incredible beauty, which she had just made from silver, and continued to recite the poem. She stood with her back to the nymph and did not even notice how he had forgiven her. Instead of the nymph, Prince Horatio appeared in that place, and Radiana continued to read the poem. Stolen glance, my heart is on fire and I am blinded by you. But the young girl did not have time to continue the poem when she heard a familiar voice which continued, Your smile is to blame for everything, and the pain in my heart, your image steals my words. Radiana turned in alarm and saw him. Horatio stood behind. He continued passionately quoting the poem, saying the following words, Your eyelids, keen eye, oh beauty. Horatio looked the young girl straight in the eyes and continued to quote, The song of Apollo, what I gave you, my love. His Highness noticed a silver flower in the hands of a bewildered Radiana and asked her if she wanted to work as a poet and a blacksmith at the same time. The girl just blinked her eyes. When the prince came closer and examined the silver product that Radiani had managed to make, he said that the girl was good at creating such masterpieces. But as soon as His Highness noticed the condition of the girl's hands, he immediately noticed that he really does not like it when something that belongs only to him is damaged. He gently took her hand, which was all scratched and burned, and touched it to his cheek. Radiana was confused. The young prince told her to take care of herself and be more careful in the future. Radiana felt goosebumps. She felt him with every cell in her body. She had already begun to forget his dizzying aroma, his oppressive presence. There was only one question in her mind. Why did he take her tools? Because without them, she will not be able to prove to everyone that she is a nymph. Therefore, the girl immediately tried to return them. So she immediately assured the prince that there would be no more wounds, and that she would be extremely careful. She tried so hard for His Highness. Horatio went to the sofa and sat down solemnly on it. He asked her to go about her business, while he would watch silently as she learned to behave safely. Radiana tried to deny His Highness, but then remembered that she shouldn't show him that she wanted to live. That's why she started working silently. Horatio admired his beauty. In his mind, he was somewhere far from here. At first, his thoughts were of his father, and that he would gladly fight him back if need be. But if Horatio would be frank with himself, then, notwithstanding that he had said so to his brother, it did not matter to him now. Showdowns with his father and all his relatives became secondary since Radiana appeared in his life. He thought about the young girl all the way home and couldn't stop thinking about it. Horatio carefully examined his beauty and tried to understand what it was about her that attracted him so much. Maybe it's because he couldn't get her delicate fingers out of his head, which were dirty from weaving baskets. Was it the fact that he was attracted to the way she quickly wiped her mouth after finishing a juicy peach? Is it possible that her sweet scent, which the prince felt when he was next to Radiana while she pretended to sleep, was to blame for everything? If you put all these little things in a pile, and Horatio's thoughts were filled with memories of a beautiful beauty, then the chaos in his thoughts dissipated somewhere, and he felt a strange peace. Radiana was engaged in the production of silver products, but her thoughts were far away. She wanted to ask Horatio why it had been raining so hard the last few days, and His Highness was in such a bad mood. Radiana remembered a conversation with a nymph who told about local customs. In order to get married, the prince must spend the first night with someone, and only then will Her Highness take care of his wife. Radiana remembered their first touches and how Horatio had said that it was enough for today, because she had to become his equal. Now all the puzzles in her head came together into a complete picture. Radiana had no idea why he chose her for the first night, because there are so many worthy nymphs and girls of royal blood in the heavenly kingdom. She wondered if it was worth it today to end it. But while she was flying somewhere far away in her thoughts, she did not pay attention to her work and burned her hand. The young girl cried out and tried to hide the wound from the prince. Of course, Horatio noticed everything and addressed the girl by name. Radiana froze and was afraid to move. She thought that maybe everything would work out, but Horatio did not think of giving up. He loudly told the girl to come to him. Radiana hid her wounded hand and replied that she was fine, and that little wound on the hand will heal so quickly. But Horatio answered in a louder tone that he could smell burning flesh, so she should come to him immediately. The girl still had to come to His Highness. He examined her wound and noted that it was not as small as Radiana had assured him. The prince said that the hand must be healed immediately. He gently took her hand and brought it to his lips. As soon as his lips touched the young girl's skin, her whole body was covered with a pleasant warmth. But Horatio's attention was drawn by some strange noise outside the window. As soon as he looked through the open shutters, he saw figures in black clothes flying past the palace. They were ambassadors. He immediately realized what a bad moment it was. After all, the ambassadors had phenomenal senses, and it was not difficult for them to notice the smell of burnt flesh. Horatio took one look at the bewildered pretty beauty and decided he needed to hide her human scent immediately. So he looked into her eyes and said that they have to finish one unfinished business, so now is the time. Radiana just lit up red from the tips of her fingers to the last hairs on her head. She was incredibly ashamed. She had no idea that it would happen so soon and right here. But Horatio was not going to put things off until later, so he gently took her in his arms and carried her to bed. When he paid attention to her face and said that the color became red, and it was most likely due to the fact that the girl spent a lot of time near the hot stove. The girl began to tell that it was not all because of the stove, but because of... But his lips did not allow the girl to convince him. Horatio began to kiss her. When the young girl was lying on the bed, she did not know what she should do. Her confused eyes just stared at the ceiling. Horatio himself proposed, but he was not sure that Radiana was ready for it. Therefore, Horatio climbed over the bed and did not know whether to continue or wait a little longer for the girl to want it so much. Radiana also jumped in and asked what the matter was, or maybe he didn't like something. She said she would do anything he asked. Radiana was worried about the fate of Gino and Nika in case of refusal. Horatio didn't know how to explain his feelings either, so he began to say that he didn't understand exactly what she was thinking right now. That young beauty did not allow him to finish his opinion, and quickly said that she understood everything, and he wanted Radiana to kiss him first. Such thoughts of hers knocked the ground out of his feet. He did not expect such a proposal, but it only led him astray. He came close to Radiana and said that she is a smart girl. He then asked if Radiana regretted her decision. She looked him firmly in the eyes and began to untangle her braid. Her golden hair fell over her shoulders. But Horatio decided to give in to her initiative and approached the beauty. Her lips stretched to meet his hot lips. In the palace of Emperor Solo, Her Highness, lying on the emperor's chest, asked him in a gentle voice when Caligo could return. She alone knew how to influence the emperor in his decisions. The wily empress whispered that the constellations had long since changed since he had left their palace. But Emperor Solo suddenly became more serious. His mood changed dramatically, and he replied that he still hears the cries of the innocent nymphs that Calgo killed. The empress shielded Caligo as best she could, and said that those nymphs were to blame, because they tried to get to his bed. But Solo was adamant, and sharply replied that Caligo had killed a girl from the royal family. This could not be forgiven, even to a native son. The Empress saw that Solo's mood was already completely spoiled, so she whispered in a gentle voice that of course His Highness was right, and Caligo was guilty. But was he guilty of inheriting his father's beauty? The woman then continued that they should allow Caligo to return, because the Crescent Festival would begin very soon. And how can Caligo not be there when even Horatio is there? But Emperor Solo was adamant in his decision. He said that the balance of heaven had been upset by Caligo's sins, and it would take more than 1,000 days for his anger to subside. The Empress realized that today she was powerless with her flattery and persuasion, so she thought a little and decided that she would try to return Caligo another time. And for today, she had to fully agree with Emperor Solo, so she bowed her head and said that if this was the Emperor's decision, she would wait meekly. The courtiers informed the Emperor that the first prince, Saltus Lumen, had arrived and wanted to see the Emperor. Solo ordered the prince to be admitted to the hall immediately. When Saltus entered, he asked his father about his well-being and kissed the hand of the Empress. Saltus Lumen said his greetings to Her Highness Avaritia Lumen and smiled at the woman. Her Highness was also pleased with this attention and said that she had heard of how the lands of Lenitua were becoming more beautiful day by day, all thanks to the incredible efforts of Saltus. The Emperor knew that Saltus wasn't just coming to ask how he was, so he decided that the conversation would be really important. Solo returned to the Empress and told her that she could be free. The Empress was surprised. What secrets could be from her? But she could not fulfill the order of the Emperor, so she turned and left the hall. The Emperor was left alone with Saltus. As they sat down at the table, Solo asked the reason for his arrival, as he never showed up unannounced. Saltus replied that he wanted to talk to him about Horatio. From the face of Emperor Solo, it was immediately clear that he did not like this topic of conversation very much. The Emperor replied to Saltus that if he wanted to discuss the judge, then he had nothing to say. But Saltus continued anyway. He asked the Emperor why he did not stop the Empress when Horatio's tutor was on the list for execution. For Horatio, it was another test, to take the life of the person who taught him everything and whom he trusted as if he were himself. Emperor Solo replied that Saltus was a very kind young man, but kindness could not restore balance to the heavens, and the heavenly scales have already changed their position due to Horatio's powers. And it was this decision that was made to restore balance to the heavenly scales. Saltus tried to reach his father and said that he was the only being that Horatio trusted, and finally asked if the Empress Avaritia had a hand in this. Emperor Sol did not expect such a direct question and accusation at the same time, so he angrily said that he was Sol, and this truth would never change even when the sun and the moon disappeared. And he added that he would never touch the heavenly scales for personal gain in his life. Finally, he asked Saltus if he did not want the goddess of fate to end his life. Saltus then harshly said that if Emperor Solo was telling the truth, then he should let Caligo and Horatio fight. But Emperor Solo, after thinking a little, replied to Saltus that the time had not yet come for this battle. Saltus asked his father if he wanted to give another chance to Caligo, who killed innocent nymphs in a fit of passion. It can also throw off the balance if that's what happens. Emperor Solo did not know what arguments to make on this matter, so he simply replied that Horatio was not suitable for the role of his heir. Then Saltus objected and said that if interpreted in a similar way, then he had no right to be called the firstborn of the great Emperor Sol. He had his reasons for thinking so, and Saltus reminded the Emperor that almost no one knew the truth about him and his wife, and who, in such a case, could understand his situation but Solo. But Emperor Solo explained to Saltus that his mother was a simple nymph, but belonged to the family of the almighty Zeus. Saltus is not like Horatio because a mortal woman gave him life. But Saltus did not want to hear these annoying excuses, and sharply asked the Emperor since when he became such a coward. Saltus was already full of emotions. He did not want to hide his guesses and decided to chatter to the end. So he told his father that because of his orders, Horatio's hands were covered in blood up to the elbows. The Emperor did not like the tone of the eldest son's speech. Until this day, he did not dare to say a word to his father in defiance. So Solo asked how he even allowed himself to talk to him in such a tone. Solo began to make excuses that Horatio was born a judge, and if he refused his role, then the balance of heaven would be disturbed. But Saltus said that Horatio is still his son. But Emperor Solo added that in addition to being a son, he is also an uncontrollable deity, and if Horatio cannot bear the burden placed on him, then his existence is a curse to all. The father no longer wanted to listen to the accusations of his eldest son, although they were all true. So he simply told Saltus not to mention Horatio's name in his presence. But Saltus finally added that they both knew perfectly well that if Horatio wished, he could burn the heavenly palace to the ground. The valet Gino looked out the window. He couldn't believe his eyes, so he asked in his voice what was happening with the weather. Gino went to the window and looked at the street. He stopped and wondered what Horatio was doing right now, since the weather was so incredible outside. But when it came to the valet, his eyes almost popped out of their sockets. He immediately thought of His Highness and the young girl, and immediately rushed to her room. Before the valet had time to appear in the rooms and see what was happening here, he shouted with all his might for Horatio to put Radiana down and not touch her. Horatio told Gino in a calm voice that he and Radiana were doing what a man and a woman usually do, and it would be wonderful if Radiana were immortal. But the valet said that Horatio should not approach Radiana until the day of the festival, especially that there should be no sexual relations. And not only intimate relationships, even holding hands, no kisses should be in their relationship with a young girl. Horatio could no longer contain his indignation, so he asked displeased how long the valet had to tell the prince what to do. The valet was just seething with anger. He shouted that he knew it would happen just like this. And he asked the prince why he had not touched anyone for 2 centuries, and that this was too much even for such a late flower. But Horatio had already lost patience, so he blinked one eye and the valet's hair started to burn. Frightened, Gino shouted that he was unbearably hot. When the angry valet left the young girl's room, Horatio looked at the beauty with a tender look and took her golden hair in his hands. His Highness sat down next to the bed on which his beauty fell asleep and quietly whispered that let them gossip about anything, but he is only sure that Radiana will be his forever. The next morning, Radiana slept longer than usual. When she opened her eyes, at first she thought she was having a real nightmare. But when the young girl got up a little in bed and tried to move her hands, she felt her whole body ache. Then she guessed that it all happened in reality. She began to go through all the events of the previous night in her mind. The thought flashed in her head that now she should live forever. When Radiana began to take a closer look at her body, she noticed how incredibly radiant her skin was. It was as if she had been covered with gold. Nifma came in just in time. She looked at her mistress and asked how she was feeling. Radiana behaved so quietly in the morning that Nika was already thinking of calling Gino's valet. The nymph asked Radiana how she was feeling. Radiana began to show her skin to the maid and told her that something strange was happening to her because her skin was shining as if the girl had been rolling on golden sand. The nymph smiled and said that Radiana was right. But Nika did not have time to prove why exactly, as she instantly disappeared, leaving behind only drops of water. Radiana noticed that her senses were sharply heightened, because this time the girl was able to hear some sharp clap in the air. Radiana put all her guesses aside and realized that Prince Horatio was somewhere very close to her. A smile appeared on the young beauty's face. Horatio opened the canopy over his beauty's bed and said that his spiritual energy spread throughout her body. And Radiana needs to drink more golden water so she doesn't suffer from pain. Prince Horatio then took the edge of the bedspread and pulled it to reveal Radiana's body. That girl grabbed the other edge of the blanket and did not allow him to do this. His Highness felt Radiana holding the other edge of the blanket tightly and asked the girl what she was doing. Radiana couldn't think of anything else but to imagine that she was feeling chilly and would like to stay covered up so she wouldn't freeze. Horatio looked at the young girl and smiled. He was surprised at her cleverness and noticed how the skin on the face of the beauty began to redden quickly. His Highness moved closer to the bed and whispered to Radiani to let him warm her since she was so chilly now. Radiana did not have time to answer, as Horatio was already by her side. Her body felt his presence, and a warm energy began to flow through it, making her heart beat faster. When his face was next to hers, Radiana blushed again. She felt ashamed of such closeness, and at the same time she did not want him to stop his actions. Now she could already feel his breath on her face. Another moment, and his lips touched hers. Again, its warmth, these emotions, these feelings. She could no longer control herself, but she did not have time to enjoy this kiss when they heard someone start screaming nearby. They both turned their heads in alarm and saw Gino's valet in the room. Gino began to shout that this is not possible, that he had already explained to His Highness that they should not come into contact with Radiana. But Horatio excused himself, like a teenager, that it was just an ordinary kiss. Horatio leaned over the girl and whispered that her little lie was pathetic enough and didn't matter. His Highness also winked at his beauty and advised her to come up with a better reason next time not to remain in her underwear in front of Horatio. But Gino's valet kept muttering that His Highness had already forgotten his warning about no physical contact until the Crescent Festival. His Highness rolled his eyes under his forehead and exhaled. He was already starting to get annoyed by this too much trouble of the valet, but Gino did not think of stopping. He returned to Radian and told her that she must drink the golden water every day because his healing powers had their limits, and she needs this water to survive. Radiana decided to immediately follow the valet's instructions, and she drank a full cup of golden water to the bottom. When the cup was empty, the young girl coughed, and the valet explained that she had absorbed too much of His Highness's spiritual energy. Horatio approached the young girl and said that she should drink water regularly. Otherwise, it will seem to her that she is just burning on the fire. Then Horatio snapped the fingers of his right hand, and a water clot appeared in the room. A moment later, a nymph was already standing in his place. His Highness ordered the maid to make sure that Lady Radiana drank the golden water every day until they left for the heavenly palace. The nymph obediently nodded her head. Then Horatio whispered in Radiana's ear that although it would not be easy, she must drink a glass of golden water a day. The young girl obediently followed all the instructions, and every day, under the watchful control of her maid, she drank a glass of golden water. When once again Radiana put an empty cup on the table, Nika said that it was a good job. But Radiana smiled and replied that she had not done anything important. Then Radiana looked at her maid and thought that it must be very difficult for Nico to be with such a mistress. Therefore, she decided to make a beautiful decoration for the nymph as a sign of gratitude. Radiana sat down at her desk and got the tools they needed. She thought about what kind of jewelry she would make for Nikki and decided that it would be a nice pin. But the young girl did not even have time to touch the instruments, as the shadow maids immediately appeared and stood right above Radiana. Radiana was even frightened by the surprise. Beads of sweat stood out on her forehead, and she asked the maids in confusion what had brought them here. The shadow handmaidens explained that His Highness had ordered that all items that could harm Radiana be taken away from the young girl. That is why they appeared here right now. Then the shadow maids did not hesitate to take away all the tools and jewelry made of silver from Radiana. The nymph, after their departure, said that it was a pity that the maids had taken everything, and the girls were especially sorry that they took away Magus's gift. But Radiana decided to somehow support the nymph and said that everything was fine and there was nothing wrong with it. But the nymph was so sorry for those ornaments that tears rolled down her cheeks by themselves. Radiana carefully wiped Nikki's tears and assured her that there was no reason for her tears at all. Late at night, the nymph Nika walked down the dark street all the way. She thought about one question: why the valet Gino called her at such a late hour. But the attention of the young maid was attracted by a strange glow. When Nika came closer, she noticed an ornament lying on the ground that had recently been taken away by the shadow maids. Nika immediately heard the voice of the valet, who asked how long she would continue to stare at the decoration. He explained that he had cast a spell on her so that no one could see her, not even His Highness. While the nymph hesitated, the valet asked if she wanted Lady Radiana to be sad again. After that, the nymph grabbed the ornament and quickly ran to her mistress. The valet Gino watched as the nymph ran quickly to the palace and asked aloud why all the nymphs are so narrow-minded. A voice was heard nearby, who said that he himself did not know the answer to this question. Frightened, Gino turned his head and saw Horatio standing nearby. His Highness angrily looked at the valet and said that as a punishment, he would not allow him to be near him at the festival. When the nymph ran to Lady Radian and showed her find, the joy of the girls knew no bounds. They forgot when they were so happy. Horatio also saw the happiness on the girls' faces and cursed himself for his valet being able to think of it before His Highness. At night, Lady Radiana woke up from the fact that dozens of dark hands were touching her. The frightened young girl covered herself with a blanket and did not know what they all wanted from her. A nymph quickly ran to help her mistress. They shouted to the shadow maids that there was no need to scare Lady Radiana and that they should stop doing so. The shadow maids stopped and looked at the nymph. They did not expect such resistance and did not know what to do, because the day before they had received clear instructions from His Highness. But when the shock passed a little, the maids explained to the nymphs that the festival of the crescent moon would soon take place, and Lady Radiana should properly prepare to visit the heavenly palace. But the nymph told the maids that she was the main one here, and they should remember that. Radiana also stood up for Nika and assured that she would immediately start preparing for her duties. But the shadow handmaidens all agreed that Lady Radiana had to hurry because there was very little time left, and they didn't want to be burned by His Highness if they failed. Although the shadowy servants had left Radiana's room, that young girl felt their presence and noticed how those servants were closely watching her from behind the windows and walls. The nymph called Radiana to her. She said that after bathing, she would anoint the young girl with aromatic oils. Since she is going as the prince's companion, she should look accordingly. The nymph explained that they had to convince everyone present at the festival that Radiana was a nymph, and then His Highness would marry. Then Nika took out some green leaves with something wrapped in them. The joyful nymph said that she had managed to bring something for Radiana and opened her stash of precious jewelry. The annoyed valet was already getting very nervous. He had already gathered a long time ago and was mumbling that how long they would be gathering, and that they would be late because of their decorations, and where they were anyway. The valet then asked His Highness if he had really decided to go with them, but Horatio was somewhere very far from here. He was completely in his thoughts. Horatio was very worried about whether everyone would believe that Radiana was a nymph and how she would be met at the festival. His Highness analyzed the appearance of his beauty and thought that in all of Povius one could not find such a weak and tender nymph. Horatio also decided that he should prepare himself in case his father rejected Radiana. He considered whether he should intervene if Solo decided to strike the girl with lightning, but his thoughts were interrupted by the servant's loud announcement that Lady Radiana had already arrived. This message brought the prince back to reality. Gino muttered nervously that they had finally arrived. The door to the hall opened, and Radiana entered. She was simply incredibly beautiful. Her hair was neatly styled, precious jewelry sparkled on her body with multicolored shades. The valet Gino had never seen such a beautiful girl in his entire life, so he even opened his mouth in surprise. Horatio also did not expect Radiana to be so beautiful, although he expected that after the nymph's enchantments over her appearance, she would be very beautiful. Radiana was unsurpassed. For several minutes, Horatio just looked at his beauty in silence and could not say a word. Then he said quietly that she allowed him to examine her. His gaze traveled all over the girl, and only then did he say that she was very similar to a nymph. Radiana was embarrassed, and a red blush appeared on her cheeks again. When the young people went outside, Radiana saw that a real ship was waiting for them at the door. This, of course, surprised the young girl. But the young girl was even more surprised when she saw a leopard on the ship. At first, she thought it was a very well-made statue. Horatio noticed that Radiana was interested in his animal and explained to the young girl that it was his first black leopard, which lived for only a century. His Highness then added that Radiana would be able to live much longer once she was able to absorb his spiritual energy. The girl only silently listened attentively to His Highness. Horatio looked into her eyes and asked her to say something, for he had the impression that he was talking to a statue. The prince hugged his beauty so that she would relax a little. Radiana looked into Horatio's eyes and said that it was all very beautiful. She meant the statue. Horatio noticed that the girl was confused and decided to give her instructions so that she would gather her thoughts and get ready to meet his relatives. He took her chin and looked into her eyes. Orasi told Radiana that she must not show her fear in Povius. He asked that the young girl remembered what she was like at their first meeting. He added that his beauty should show the whole world that she is a worthy chosen one of the Prince of the Sun, Horatio Lumen. The confused girl just blinked her eyes and could not answer anything. Also, Horatio finally added that he would not tolerate such treatment when they left the ship, and in Povius she must play the role of his companion so that she can start right now. Radiana was confused and decided to consult her maid. She found the nymph on the ship and said they needed to talk urgently. Nika happily agreed to Radiana's proposal. When the girls were left alone, Radiana took the nymph's hand and immediately asked the question that interested her the most. She asked if Nika had ever fallen in love in her life. Nikki's eyes even lit up after such a question. She said that of course she fell in love. Love for a nymph is like breathing. At the mere mention of love, the heart accelerates its rhythm madly. Then Radiana asked the nymphs, "How should you look at someone if you love?" Nika thought, she never even noticed how to look. This is a starred question. But after thinking a little, the nymph still came up with an idea. She said that it was necessary to recall the best thing that Radiana had seen in her life. The nymph began to outline the options of what Radian should remember in her head, and these were the following suggestions: something beautiful, something wonderful, something incredible. Radiana began to go through in her head all the beautiful things that she managed to see in her life, and the only thing that came to her mind was Horatio. His powerful body, beautiful hair, facial features. Radiana herself was afraid of her thoughts. She blushed from her fantasies, grabbed her head, and thought that it couldn't be. It seemed that Radiana was beginning to lose her mind. It dawned on Radiana that the most beautiful, incredible, wonderful, and beautiful thing she had ever seen in her life was Horatio. This began to remind the girl of the story of foolish mortals who fell in love with deities, and Radiana could not believe that she had become one of them. His Highness's voice brought Radian out of his thoughts and into reality. He said that the girl had enough time to practice because she was already making God wait. Confused, Radiana could only say that of course it was. She didn't even expect that he would find her so quickly to show her what she had learned. Horacio gently hugged the young girl and was surprised that she replied that she had already practiced. So he invited Radiana to demonstrate exactly what she had learned. But Radiana was confused and did not know how to demonstrate this to her. Only one question pulsated in her head. What should she do now? Drops of cold sweat appeared on his back from excitement. She clearly decided that she needed to raise her head and look into his eyes. But look so that everyone will believe that she is head over heels in love with him, and there is no way back for her. But Horatio carefully looked into her eyes and said that she had disappointed him. He asked her to look at him again. And even after that, her look did not change in any way, so Horatio only looked disappointedly at the beauty. Radiana realized that at such rates she would not only expose herself at the festival, but would not even get off the ship. Therefore, she began to go through all possible options in her head. It occurred to her that she should think of Horatio not as a god, but as a mere mortal. Radiana decided to imagine him as a man who had just been disappointed in his beloved. Radiana gathered all her imagination and decided to try once more to look at Horatio with amorous eyes. She dared and called His Highness. Horatio turned and looked at the young girl. She looked directly into the eyes of the young man. Her gaze was tender and full of feelings. He lost the gift of speech for a moment. The ship sailed non-stop for 1.5 days. Radiana spent a lot of time on the deck and constantly admired the scenery. She had never seen such incredible beauties in her life. A valet approached her and informed her that they would arrive soon. Povius and Tesca are located at opposite ends of the heavens, which is why the journey takes so long. Gino begged Radiana to be constantly vigilant, because Povius is significantly different from Tesk. One mistake and the local residents will eat the young girl with her guts. Radian's eyes widened in surprise. Of course, she did not expect such serious instructions, so she decided that she needed to be very careful and take advantage of Gino's advice. The valet advised Radiana to play the role of Prince Horatio's companion, the only way she would survive this journey. He advised Radiana to remember his words well. The valet also gave some advice to Radian and told her to stay close to Horatio at all times if she wanted to survive in the terrarium where she was headed now. Finally, after such a long journey, the shore began to be seen from the ship. It was the majestic Povius, where the most influential deities of the Celestial Empire lived. Horatio spent almost the entire trip alone, and before his eyes was constantly the image of Radiana, who trained to look at him with a loving look. He constantly wondered if she felt something for him, if the feelings were recorded. He was worried that Radiana might not be interested in him. His Highness was deep in thought when he heard someone calling him. He would have recognized that voice out of 1,000, so he didn't have time to turn around as he knew his beauty would be standing there. When their eyes met, he simply dissolved into hers. She did not have the courage to ask if she deserved praise. He could not say a word for several minutes. He just admired the beauty. Horatio looked at the young girl and could not help but admire her beauty. Then he overpowered himself and said that she was quite convincing. Radiana was glad that she managed to please the prince. Horatio then placed his gentle hand on Radiana's head and said that he wished her luck at the festival. Their attention was distracted by loud shouts. Radiana looked at the shore. A whole crowd of people had gathered on the shore, waiting for the ship to arrive. They all shouted loudly that they welcomed the great judge Povius Prince Horatio Lumen. Radiana watched them from the ship and thought that Horatio must be respected and admired here, since so many people came out to meet him. His Highness stood solemnly on the ship and bathed in the joyous shouts of the crowd. He was pleased that people were so supportive of him coming to the Crescent Festival. Horatio then turned to the young girl and said that they would see each other later. His Highness headed for the exit. Confused, Radiana was left alone in this unknown place. Displeased, Terra threw her jewelry so that the mirror cracked. She shouted to the maids to bring more beautiful ornaments, for she must impress Prince Horatio. The Empress slowly entered the room. She asked her niece what the fuss was about. Terra turned and greeted Her Highness in a low bow. They both looked into the broken mirror. The Empress said that Terry had access to Povius's best jewelry, so what's the deal? Terra explained that Prince Horatio had brought a nymph with him to the festival. Nervous, Terra began to complain to the Empress that all this was not enough. Maybe the decoration created by the famous Mr. Magus would have saved the situation. The Empress smiled and asked if Terra was worried about losing to some ugly nymph because of a couple of ornaments, so she better not take such small things into her head. The Empress loudly ordered her handmaidens to immediately see to it that Terra was properly dressed, and the sooner the better. Her Highness picked up the ornament that Terra had tossed a few minutes ago and told the girl to stop throwing tantrums immediately, as her patience was already wearing thin. The Empress then came up behind Terra, wrapped her arms around her waist, and told the girl to remember her child before she started getting nervous. Terra was simply numb. Drops of cold sweat appeared on her forehead. She quickly began to excuse herself and told Her Highness that she had no idea what child the Empress was talking about. The enraged Empress slapped Terry so hard that the poor girl fell to the floor. Her Highness shouted that how dare she lie to the Empress. The Empress shouted at the girl, who still could not recover from the blow. Her Highness asked if Terra wanted her child to die before birth, or if she wanted him to be raised as a sun prince. In the end, the Empress told the girl that this was her last warning, and Terra must do everything to deceive the fate of heaven. And maybe if she wins Horatio, she will save her child. A broken Terra sat on the floor. She simply seethed with anger and injustice. Her only goal at the time was to do whatever it took to have Horatio as hers. In the main hall of His Highness Sol Lumen's palace, it was loudly announced that Prince Horatio of Tesca had already arrived at the palace. A whisper spread through the hall that she would finally see Horatio with her own eyes. A well-dressed, handsome Prince Horatio appeared in the hall. The women began to whisper that finally the prince had a companion, and everyone wanted to see the one chosen by Horatio himself. There was also a whisper in the crowd that it was necessary to take the green pills, and some started taking them right away. And Horatio also noticed how the courtiers took Rhinum. Prince Horatio thought to himself that they were all fools, and didn't even know that the Rhinum didn't really work, even though the voices in the prince's head had become quieter after taking the pill. Prince Horatio strode confidently up to Solo Lumen's throne. On his right hand sat the incomparable Empress, on his left, the first son, Saltus Lumen. Prince Horatio was the first to greet the present honorary host of the palace and asked Solo Lumen if he was feeling well now. Solo Lumen looked at his son and said that he thought Horatio of Tesco was in perfect order. Of course, he expected to see his son in a worse state after his conversation with Saltus. Horatio smiled back and said that he had no reason to complain, since after 2 centuries he was finally able to enter into intimacy with a young nymph. At the same time, after his words, all the women began to whisper and discuss such news, although gossip about his relationship had been circulating for a long time. The Empress smiled and said that this was very good news, so she was glad to hear it and congratulated Horatio. Horatio also told Her Highness that she was absolutely right, that this was very good news. Then, after these standard exchanges of pleasantries, Horatio made his way to the throne and took his place of honor next to his older brother Saltus Lumen. The Empress turned to Saltus and asked him how his wife Vicaria was doing. Saltus informed everyone present that he had been told recently that his wife had begun to have seizures. The Empress rejoiced and told her husband that soon His Highness would have his first grandchild. Then the Empress turned to Horatio and asked him when he would introduce them to his companion, because they were already lost in guesses as to who could have won Horatio's favor. Horatio assured everyone in a calm voice that his companion should soon arrive at the palace. The Empress said that was all very well, but first she wanted to introduce him to Terra, daughter of Vaum of the House of Pyros, who was soon to be his bride. Everyone was sure that Horatio would like Terra. The girl bowed and said that Terraconium was at his service. Terra tried to be as polite and friendly as possible. Horatio cast his gaze on Terra, who was crawling out of her skin to please Prince Horatio Lumen. But then Horatio turned his head round and paid no attention to Terra at all. But she was shocked, because she thought that she would win the heart and attention of His Highness at first glance. Orasi then abruptly stood up from his throne. Even his older brother became uneasy from such an act, who asked in fear what Horatio was going to do now. But the calm Horatio said that he apologizes for the inconvenience, but his beloved companion has arrived, so he must meet her. The whole hall was loudly announced that the guests had arrived. The valet Gino was the first to enter the central hall of the palace. He greeted the guests and smiled at Horatio. Then an incredibly beautiful and well-dressed young girl entered the hall. Her golden hair was decorated with precious stones and very beautiful silver jewelry. Horatio immediately went to Radiana and gently hugged her around the waist. He wanted her to relax and not worry under the gaze of the guest present. Radiana was grateful to Horatio for his support and looked at him with a tender look. Horatio whispered softly in her ear that it was time for her charms. The prince covered her eyes with his warm hand. Horatio stood behind his companion and asked the permission of Sol Lumen, son of the sun and his venerable father, to present to him Radiana, his first love. Sol Lumen looked at the young girl and his son and said that he could let go of his hand. When Horatio released his hand, Radian's gaze met the emperor's watchful gaze. She immediately lowered her head and said that the nymph Radian, descendant of Circe, was ready to serve him. This announcement gave rise to a new reason for discussion. All the court women began to whisper that this girl is a descendant of the weak stone goddess Circe. Saltus was pleasantly surprised by the education and beauty of Horatio's chosen one and said that they were glad to welcome the nymph to this festival of the crescent moon. Solo Lumen loudly told Radiana that if she claimed to be a descendant of Circe, could she show anything to prove her words. Radiana was not confused and answered the emperor that she could create jewelry from silver threads. The empress immediately noticed the silver lily in Radiana's head, created by Mr. Magus. The empress hoped that Radiana might be embarrassed here, so she invited the nymph to demonstrate her skill in jewelry making right here. Immediately, tools necessary for work and even a stove appeared in the hall, so there was no way back. The valet's heart began to beat faster. Solo Lumen said Radiana could start. That girl was not even nervous. As soon as she saw the familiar tools, she immediately got to work. A fragile young girl took a hammer and tongs skillfully and began to make an ornament. It was such an exciting and extraordinary sight that everyone present dropped their mouths. The nymphs began to whisper that they had never seen a nymph work with silver using the heat of a furnace. They also discussed what else she could have learned in the Magus cave. A few minutes later, a beautiful silver ornament curled in Radian's skilled hands. She took it in her hands and asked Sol Lumen's permission to give him this silver rose. Solo Lumen took the gift in his hands and was sincerely surprised by such exquisite work. He said aloud that he recognized Radiana, a descendant of Circe, as Horatio's beloved. Solo then turns to Horatio and says that his son has proven his worth, so he insists on a quick wedding between Horatio and Terra. Horatio quietly said that if it was the will of the gods. The empress smiled gloatingly. She will finally soon get what she wanted and marry Terra and Horatio. Solo Lumen announced to the entire palace that let the sunlight shine on this quiet night for the mighty descendants of the sun god. Horatio clung to Radiana and did not leave her for a moment. Solo continued by announcing the start of the festival. He said that everyone was having fun until the first rays of light appeared in the sky, and the festival began. All the present guests started to celebrate. The best varieties of wines were offered in a wide range. Men and women chatted cheerfully over a glass of alcohol. Radiani was not into alcoholic drinks. She did not take her eyes off the thrones on which all the most respected gods of the heavenly kingdom sat. They looked down on their subordinates. Of course, she was most interested in only one of the gods, and it was Horatio Lumen. She kept looking at him and wanted to meet his eyes to feel supported. Horatio also watched his beauty and noticed how the young lady's gaze changed to one warm and full of feeling, although in his mind there were doubts about the sincerity of her gaze. Such a peaceful idyll was disturbed by someone's voice. Radiana turned and noticed how a well-dressed young girl, accompanied by her maids, was purposefully approaching her down the hall. Finally, the young girl came closer to Radiana, and she was able to get a better look at her. It was immediately clear from her expensive clothes and jewelry that she belonged to a rich family. As soon as the young person approached Radiana, she took offense and, without introducing herself, told the echidnas that she was the same stone nymph who wears the silver lily created by Mr. Magus. She then asked Radian if Mr. Magus had actually personally taught the nymph to work with silver threads. Radiana looked with surprised eyes at the young person who was so interested in her person and confirmed that this is exactly how it is. Then the young girl did decide to introduce herself and said that her name was Terraconium and that she came from the famous Pyros family, and she is engaged to Prince Horatio, the son of the sun god. Such a presentation simply knocked the ground out from under Radiana's feet. She was at a loss as to whether she should say that she was glad to meet her or express her hope for another meeting. Radiana decided that she had to make sure that Prince Horatio would marry. But Terra waved her hand and told the girl not to try to appear too well-mannered. One of the maids whispered to her mistress that she had heard that the centaurs were very fond of beautiful young women, and they started giggling together. Terra then turned to Radiana, and with a smile on her face said for all present to hear that Radiana must have seduced Mr. Magus into helping her. Confused, Radiana blushed with shame. She could not even think that such nonsense could come to someone's head. The young girl just quietly said that she had no idea what she was talking about, but Terra only continued her guesses as to how an unknown nymph could become Prince Horatio's first lady, and added that Radiana could tell the truth about what she was like in bed. The valet heard all this conversation and came to help the confused girl. He said that Terra was being funny because Magus and Radiana's relationship was not at all what she was implying. Terra turned blue with indignation. She asked angrily, how dare some worthless elf even sneer at her, let alone call her ridiculous? Terra immediately used her magic power, and the valet began to suffocate. It became harder and harder for him to breathe, and he fell to the floor. Only after that did Terra stop her torture. Frightened, Radiana ran to the valet and asked if he was all right. The girl was very scared for him and tried to bring Gino to his senses. Enraged, Radiana turned to Terra and angrily asked her what she was doing and why she was behaving like that with the valet, since he had said nothing wrong. But Terra just laughed and told Radiana not to tell her that she was on the side of this poor elf. She also added that Radiana only served as her replacement in Prince Horatio's bed. Terra reminded Radiana that she didn't belong here and to not forget where she truly belonged. Finally, Terra wanted to ask the girl how it was in bed with Horatio. Radiana was already on her nerves. This curious bride of Horatio proved her with her quips and barbed remarks. She stood up and proudly looked directly into the eyes of this person. Radiana asked. Probably Terra wanted to hear the details of their first night, so she had something to say. Radiana said that at first she felt an incredible heat, then she began to melt in the arms of Prince Horatio. And also, the young girl obediently fulfilled all the requests of the hot prince. When Radiana finished her story, she even remembered the incredible sensations that covered her whole body. So she finally asked if Terry had enough details. After that, there was an oppressive silence in the hall. All eyes were directed at the two young girls who were standing opposite each other and figuring out their relationship. The girls were also silent. Radiana wondered in her mind whether she had done the right thing in telling her about it, because she did not want to share such intimate details of her relationship with Horatio at all. She was all the more glad that Prince Horatio would soon marry. It was for this that she had to try. Then Radiana could live peacefully and create jewelry from silver. Radiana did not have time to think about her words and dreams about the future when she felt a hot and strong slap on her cheek. The young girl did not expect this from her side at all. Radiana fell to the floor from such a strong blow. Jewels from her hair were scattered all over the hall. Terra proudly sat over Radiana and looked triumphantly at the girl. The nymph saw her mistress fall and rushed to help her. She felt sorry for Radian, and if she could, she would have torn that rascal who dared to raise a hand to the girl right on the spot. Radiana touched her cheek, which hurt so much that it throbbed even in her head. The girl's first thought was that she had not lived up to the expectations of her Horatio, who had asked her to try. The nymph ran up to Radiana in a second. She helped the girl up and asked how she was feeling. They both knew that this should not have happened under any circumstances. Furious, Terra shouted that Radiana was a brazen bastard. And how did she even dare to insult a representative of the Pyros family? Because this miserable nymph was just lucky enough to become a litter for a prince. At the same moment, Horatio appeared next to the girls. He was unhappy with what was happening here. He asked loudly what kind of showdown was going on in the middle of the hall. Horatio returned to Radiana and asked the bewildered girl to explain what exactly happened here. Terra was mentally celebrating her victory. She achieved what she wanted. She thought that none of the princes would want to deal with the nymph he had used. Terra decided to be the first to talk about the dispute exactly as she wanted. Therefore, she said that she should not have responded to the nymph's insults, so he should not interfere in this senseless dispute. Then Horatio looked at Radiana and asked if it was really only her fault, and everything that Tara had just told was true. Confused, Radiana only whispered that it wasn't true. She did not know what to do in this situation. Should she tell the whole truth, or just remain silent? Horatio approached his beauty and gently touched her red cheek. He said that he does not like it when what belongs to him is damaged. So he asked Radiana if she wanted to hit Tara back, or if he should just cut off the hands of this offending woman. Tara almost lost consciousness from what she heard. Radiana held her red cheek with her hand and thought she should answer Horatio. Without thinking for a long time, he repeated his question once more and waited for the decision that his beauty would make. Suddenly, the Empress herself appeared in the epicenter of events. She noticed from her seat that something was wrong and came to help her niece. She looked sternly at the girls. Her Highness tried to soften the situation and somehow influence Horatio so that he would not harm her favorite. She said softly that the prince must be joking because all women are jealous. The Empress added that women lose their heads when it comes to men. Therefore, there is no point in complicating everything, because Tara just had a little quarrel with his nymph. The Empress added that this is of course their tradition, and no lady likes to have what belongs to her taken away from her. Horatio looked at the Empress and asked in what sense he belonged to Terry. Horatio said loudly, in a firm tone, so that not only Her Highness Avarisha could hear, that he did not belong to anyone in this world, therefore such statements were not appropriate. At that time, for a moment, Avarisha felt herself drowning in the darkness of Horatio's eyes. She didn't feel well. She almost coughed up the rhinum pill she had taken shortly before the festival. The Empress decided to somehow smooth things over and explained to Horatio that his father had announced that he and Tara were engaged, and that is why it is his duty to marry a girl. But Horatio only asked what other duty he owed to his uncle. His mood was completely spoiled, so no one knew how to calm the angry Horatio. His older brother Saltus decided to help. He also went down to the hall and said that until today, Horatio had never been angry over such trifles. With one movement of his hand, Saltus immediately healed the wound from the slap on Radiana's face, and her skin became snow-white again, as if no one had touched her. Saltus asked them not to make a fuss about this minor misunderstanding and to return to their seats as they were to continue celebrating the Crescent Festival. But Horatio explained in a calm voice that his lover had not yet answered the question, so he believed that the incident was not over yet. He will wait for Radiana's response. The Empress already angrily said that she knew that the nymph had taken over his body, but she had no idea that it also concerned the heart. She added that Horatio spent too much time at Tesca. Her Highness asked how he could offend the wills of Povius, and how could he even think of cutting off the hand of the goddess because of the blow of some nymph? Did he imagine himself as the judge of all gods? But Horatio seemed not to pay attention to all the arguments of the Empress. He once again asked Radian for an answer before he cut off Terry's hand and brought it to his lover. The Empress realized that Horatio would not calm down, so she put on a cheerful face and asked the nymph to tell her answer to everyone present if the prince insisted. Confused, Radiana looked carefully at the Empress. She saw that Avarisha looked happy and contented, but she had already seen such a predatory look in her life. Radiana understood that such a woman would stop at nothing to achieve what she wanted. For this, she will not blink an eye and will give other people's lives. She was very similar to Gracia. Radiana understood that she needed to get out of this situation as soon as possible, because she has already gone so far that no one can simply forget about her. Therefore, Radiana decided to somehow influence the mood of her prince. She hoped that he would listen to her words and they would be able to solve such a difficult problem. She looked at Horatio and said that she did not think it was worth taking the hand of the goddess Tara from his highness. After all, nothing matters when Prince Horatio is by her side. Radina also explained that this dispute is her fault because she dared to share the details of their first night. And of course, no woman can listen so calmly. Then Radiana came closer to Horatio and gently took his hand. She quietly said that if he wanted to order anyone, it should be Radiana herself. Radiana then blushed and added that she didn't want him ordering her right here. It would be better to do it alone. So she asked Horatio to forget about this stupid dispute. All those present have long surrounded the culprits of such an incident and caught every word of the gods. When Radiana finished her speech, everyone was even a little upset that she would not see the punishment today. Radiana looked into Horatio's eyes and asked him to discuss all the details in private. He drowned in the eyes of his beloved and already forgot what he wanted to do. Of course, Horatio could not resist such a request of his beloved and said that of course he would do as she wished. The Empress even opened her mouth in surprise. Of course, she thought that this nymph would take advantage of such an opportunity and try to cut off the hand of the offender. Horatio gently took Radiana in his arms and told the Empress that his beloved was not interested in revenge, so they would postpone all disputes for later, because at the moment he had more important things to do. After a moment, Horatio and Radiana disappeared from the hall. The Empress still could not recover from the scandal and stood in the middle of the hall as if enchanted. She did not expect that Horatio had such feelings for the nymph. In the mortal world, in the room next to the arena, Grazia Mundos accepted the advances of men trying to woo the fastidious young girl. Suddenly, the door of the room opened, and a tall young man entered, who loudly exclaimed that he had not seen Grazia for many years. Gracia rose from the bed and shouted for Alexis to watch his stupid tongue, for Gracia was not her name now. This man was Gracia's half-brother, Alexis Mundos. Alexis Mundos, with a smile on his face, asked if those present knew the young girl's real name. Gracia decided to get down to business right away. She was sure that her brother had not come here just to say hello. She directly asked him if he had run out of money. Alexis Mundos began to say that he had heard from people that Grazia was making very good money in the arena. An angry Gracia sternly said that he knows very well that she spends almost all the funds to support the gladiators, and she has no money at the moment. But Alexis just laid down majestically on her bed and said that they were different from her. She is good at making money, and he is good at spending it, and he always believed in her success in this matter. Alexis Mundos also added that she pretends to be a priestess, secretly supports gladiator fights, and, in addition to everything, manages to warm the bed of a noble man. She looked at him in such a way that she wanted to kill him immediately. But he only asked her not to look at him like that, because he would keep her secret that she sacrificed herself at the ceremony. When Radiana and Horatio found themselves alone in a beautiful garden, the young girl could not help but admire the scenery there. Everything was fabulously beautiful, including plants and exotic animals. She asked His Highness to put her on her feet so that she could better look at that beauty. On top of that, it was a starry night outside, so the scenery looked even more magical. When Horatio fulfilled her wishes, and the young girl stood opposite him, he looked passionately into her eyes and asked if she was ready to receive the punishment she had asked for a few minutes ago. Radiana felt cold inside. She looked at the prince and asked what kind of punishment awaits her. He explained that he would punish her like an adult and hoped that she would not lose consciousness. The valet could not stop. He poured himself glass after glass and immediately emptied her to the bottom. Gino was barely able to stay on his feet, but he was not going to stop. The nymph began to worry about the valet, so she told him that if he did not stop, she would get drunk until he passed out. And that's all they need to get into trouble. Nika dared to approach the valet and took the wineglass from his hands. He shouted angrily, "Why does she allow herself to look at him from a height and create such a disgrace?" The nymph was constantly thinking about her mistress. She said thoughtfully that she hoped Radiana was all right, for when the crescent moon was above them, His Highness would surely do so. The valet was already on the tip and told her to close the pelka. After all, he shouted that Prince Horatio could not forget his duty. Then for a moment the valet fell silent and began to listen to his own feelings. He immediately realized that something had happened. The valet shouted to the whole hall for everyone to behave more quietly and called the nymph. Gino said that they urgently need to find Radiana and Horatio. A few minutes later, the excited nymph stood next to the valet in front of the palace gate. Gino shouted loudly to the guards to open the door immediately. As soon as the door opened, the valet rushed inside. A nymph quickly ran behind him. When they entered the hall, they saw Radiana lying unconscious on the floor in the middle of it. Horatio was sitting over the young girl. He looked at his beauty in confusion. Annoyed, Gino immediately set about rescuing Radiana. He tried to bring her back to consciousness. Gino muttered that the prince needed to learn to control himself, because then he would kill Radiana. But Horatio himself did not expect that the young girl would not endure. He explained that he was simply following her wishes, exactly what she asked for. The Sun Prince looked at the valet in confusion. The valet tried his best to bring Radiana back to life, but after several attempts, he was doomed to say that his healing power did not work this time. Horatio looked at the valet, then at his beauty, who had already been unconscious for a long time. The prince called the nymph to him and ordered to call Prince Saltus. In another room of the palace, Tara was sobbing bitterly. She sat on the floor and watched her tears fall in a hail of tears. Suddenly, the door to the room opened with a powerful force. The empress, who was out of humor, showed at the door. She shouted, "Tara!" to the whole room. Then Her Highness quickly walked towards the crying girl and slapped her hard. The empress was no joke angry. She would have been willing to kill Tara. Tara clutched her cheek and cried some more. It wasn't sweet for her anyway, and then Aunt Avaricia added fuel to the fire. The empress yelled that Tara was a dumb girl, because after wearing a whole bunch of precious jewelry, Tara couldn't defeat the worthless nymph. Tara sobbed bitterly. Her tears had already formed a whole puddle on the hall floor. The empress shouted in exasperation that no more sobbing, she must correct her mistake immediately, but Tara still had a drop of dignity left. That is why she said that she is a goddess from a noble family, and she cannot bow before a worthless nymph. That empress shouted angrily that she had lost the crown in this battle. Therefore, the empress can get rid of Tara's entire family in one fell swoop, and it was not necessary to disappoint Her Highness. Avaricia said that she turned a blind eye to Tara's relationship with another, and did not understand how a stupid girl dared to go to the doctor to find out the condition of that unborn wretch. Crying Tara explained through tears that she had unbearable pains in the lower abdomen, and she was afraid that she might lose the child, so she turned to the doctor for help. But the angry empress was not ready to listen to such excuses, so she pushed Tara even harder. She shouted that it would be better for the bastard to die than for them to be in so much trouble now. The empress shouted that the young girl was still alive only because she could benefit the empress. She moved even closer to Tara and snarled viciously that she'd better comply with Her Highness's request, or she'd lose her head if she didn't, so it was time to pay the bills. Avaricia folded her arms at her sides and ordered Terry to get up immediately. She can wipe out Tara's entire family in an instant, so if she wants to live, she must marry Horatio. Tara didn't know what to do. At the end, the empress shouted that Tara could at least kiss the nymph's feet, and whether the Pyros family would continue to exist or be lost forever would depend only on her. Radiana finally opened her eyes. Everything was mixed up in her head, and she could not understand what happened and where exactly she was for a long time. So she carefully looked around. When she noticed the young man nearby, she immediately remembered seeing him at the Crescent Festival. It was Horatio's brother, Saltus. He also looked at the girl and asked if she was okay. Saltus was not in a good mood, so he didn't want to have long talks with Radiana. He said she might not thank him for saving her. He quickly turned around and went to the exit. Finally, he told the bewildered girl that she was mortal, so she had to keep as far away from Prince Horatio's bed as possible if she wanted to stay alive. The nymph immediately ran to Radiana and asked how her mistress was feeling. Nika began to tell that she was very scared for Radiana. She could not even think that Prince Horatio could do such a thing to her right in the imperial palace. But this was the last thing that bothered Radian at the moment. She was confused and frightened by the words of Prince Halibut. Now she had a more general question. Radiana looked into her maid's eyes and asked in confusion what she should do now that Prince Saltus had learned that she was mortal. Horatio was sitting alone in his room. His thoughts were somewhere far from here. He was next to his beloved. In recent days, he couldn't get Radiana out of his head. His loneliness was disturbed by his older brother. Saltus, who had just brought Radiana back to life, entered the room and asked his brother why he had deceived Sol, the sun god. Horatio explained in a calm voice that he wasn't fooling anyone. Saltus then asked if Her Highness knew that Radiana was mortal. Horatio turned his head in his brother's direction and asked if it mattered now. And why ask so many questions at all? Saltus was getting impatient, so he said the human girl must be dead. And why did Horatio save her at all, if only for the sake of satisfying his passion? But Horatio explained that she was sacrificed by humans, and now Radiana is his only and first woman. Therefore, he advised to stop arguing about this issue. Saltus still insisted on his point. He firmly told Horatio that he must get rid of the human woman, and the sooner the better. Horatio insisted, so he told Saltus that he must have noticed that Radiana had his energy running through her veins, so she was also immortal. Saltus said that this is his last warning, and he must first remember that he is the Sun Prince, the judge of the heavens, and a divine being. But Horatio replied that he wanted none of that. But Saltus said what his fate was. Horatio replied that if Saltus did not want Povius to end up in Caligo's hands, then he should not interfere in Horatio's affairs. Also, Prince Horatio added that if something does not happen as Horatio wants, then he will burn everything to his grandfather in heaven. A cold sweat broke out on the back of the fearful brother at Horatio's words. He asked him if he really wanted to fight their own father Saul, but Horatio calmly looked out of the window and said only that when that happened, he would spare Linitua if Saltus so wished. Saltus loudly replied that he was tired of Horatio's pride and arrogance, so he had to take responsibility for his men. After these words, Horatio laughed loudly and asked what kind of people his elder brother was referring to. Horatio then opened the curtain that separated them from the central hall and calmly told Saltus that they must go now, for the festival had just begun. As every year, the beginning of the festival was opened by an incredible firework. Hundreds of bright lights lit up the sky. None of those present wanted to miss this exciting spectacle. Radiana also could not take her eyes off such beauty. She tried to remember every moment because she had never in her life been present among the gods at a celebration. Radiana admired the salutes, and in her mind she was next to her Horatio. She was brought back to reality by the loud voice of her maid calling out to Radiana. When Radiana turned her head, she saw Nika carrying a huge glass with some kind of drink. As soon as the nymph drew him closer, she explained to Radiani that it was nectar, the drink of the gods. Radiana looked at the red drink and asked what it was called. She had never even heard of such a thing. Radiana looked into the cup and told her maid that this drink was probably not worth drinking. But the nymph only replied sadly that Lady Radiana should not behave like that. The upset nymph explained that they have such a tradition that if the hostess does not take the first sip, then she does not have the right to try the drink of the gods, and she wants it so much. The nymph offered Radiani to drink just one glass. The young girl timidly took a sip of that strange drink. The tart, sweet taste of the drink pampered Radiana's taste buds. The nymph could hardly wait for Radiana to start drinking the drink of the gods, and immediately began to taste it herself. Nika even closed her eyes to better savor this miracle. This drink poured over the nymph's body in a hot stream. She was delighted and said that she had never had to pay anything like that. The mood immediately improved several times. Satisfied girls discussed the taste properties of the amazing drink and decided that it is worth trying another glass, because after one taste, they could not taste it. The valet was pacing from side to side and nervously going through options for talking to Radiana in his head. He didn't know how to ask if she was okay, if it was obvious to a fool that she wasn't. The valet blamed Prince Horatio for treating the poor girl like that. Gino was clutching a green plant in his hand and could not dare to enter the girl's room. But then the valet heard a loud female laugh. He was not kidding that Lady Radiana had lost her sanity. The valet immediately decided to see what happened to the young girl. He ran to the door of the room and quickly opened it. But upon entering, the valet's gaze stopped at the empty cup. The remains of the red drink were visible on the walls of the bowl. On either side of the bowl sat a nymph and Lady Radiana. They laughed merrily at any silly jokes. A red blush was visible on both girls' cheeks. The nymph was the first to notice the valet. She cheerfully greeted Gino. The nymph decided to approach the valet, but the gait was somewhat uneven. Still, with grief, the nymph reached the valet and said that their little valet seemed to have grown a little. She also offered to join their fun. The valet guessed that the nymph was on a tip and decided to see for himself what exactly the girls drank. He ran up to the empty cup and asked the girls what was in it. As Gino leaned over the bowl, he smelled a familiar aroma. He immediately understood that there was nectar, and they drank it down. And such a quantity is enough for the deity to fall off his feet. Lady Radiana noticed that the valet did not come empty-handed and asked if he really had not forgotten and brought her the papyrus. The valet handed the papyrus to Radiani, and she began to look at it cheerfully. She looked at the papyrus and laughed. The young girl repeated that she could not believe it. Confused, the valet stared at Lady Radiana, who was quite drunk. He didn't know what to do with drunk girls. Fate has not thrown him such a test yet. While the valet was looking at Radiana and deciding what to do next, the nymph had already fallen off her feet and was lying on the floor of their room. Suddenly, the valet felt the presence of His Highness. He was so glad that Horatio could read minds, so he decided to immediately call him for help. The valet immediately mentally decided to explain what happened here, because he did not count on an adequate explanation from the girls. Gino told the prince that he was very glad to see him. Crying Tara sat on the floor of her own room and could not recover from such a fiasco. In her head, like the ringing of bells, the words of the Empress rang out that the fate of the family was in her hands. While everyone was happily celebrating at the festival and admiring the incredible salute, Tara thought only that whether or not the treacherous family would continue to exist now depended only on her and that cursed nymph. Meanwhile, the Empress was in her chambers. She also decided to rest and think carefully about the situation that developed after the appearance of Radiana in Horatio's life. But while she has not yet found a solution to this problem, the Empress decided to get rid of unnecessary witnesses who knew too much. Therefore, she called the guards and ordered to kill all the nymphs present. Bloodthirsty Avaricia did not even blink an eye while the guards killed the unfortunate nymphs. She continued to eat her dinner while the room was filled with the blood of nymphs begging for help. The Empress was simply enraged that the self-righteous Horatio dared to challenge her, the Empress of Povius. She also decided that she needed a stronger Renum because the prince's power had increased. Her thoughts were interrupted by someone's presence. A whirlwind of blue color appeared in the room, and the frightened Empress turned her head in his direction. When the blue vortex appeared in front of Avaricia's eyes, she asked him who he was. And when he spoke to Her Highness and called her mother, she guessed that Caligo had come. The Empress was glad to hear the voice of her own son and asked how he was doing. Caligo replied that so far everything was fine, and he had an opportunity to get to her unnoticed. The Empress immediately decided to tell her son about the state of affairs. She said they don't have much time right now, but she's doing everything she can to get him back to Tesca. Caligo listened carefully to the Empress's speech, and after thinking answered that he would not be safe there. But the Empress assured her own son that he needn't worry about it. She will definitely do everything possible and impossible to make Povius belong to him. Also, at the end, the Empress added that very soon they would show the whole world that Horatio is a monster, and she has already figured out how to do it in the shortest possible time. At the festival, all the gods sat on their thrones. Horatio also looked at the guests present, but his gaze was empty, and his thoughts were far from here. He was constantly thinking about his beloved. A man approached Horatio and addressed His Highness. He introduced himself. It was Valmconium of the House of Pyros. This respectable man was Tara's father. Wam came closer to Horatio and said that he had come to beg for mercy because his daughter Tara had been very rude and behaved indecently towards the nymph. Horatio took a closer look at the respectable man and asked only if he was really the father of that Tara. Tara's father blushed in embarrassment. He could not even think that in his old age he would ask for pardon because of his daughter's behavior. Wam said that she is still very young and immature. This conversation was carefully listened to by Horatio's older brother, Saltus. He also intervened in the conversation and advised Horatio to accept the man's apology, because it would do them no good to be at war with the Pyros family now. Horatio thought a little, listened to the words of his older brother, and asked again whose apology he should accept. He did not even think of forgiving those who dared to insult his beloved. Horatio then added that the father would pass something on to his daughter, and it was somewhat an offer to come to Horatio when Tara agreed to become his concubine. Wama felt cold inside. He questioned again if Horatio really meant that his daughter from the Pyrrhus family was a concubine. He did not expect to hear that. Everyone understood that Tara was of noble blood. She also belonged to one of the main branches of the Pyrrhus family, the Sincerum family. There have never been such cases in history when such women became concubines. Horatio looked at the reaction of Tara's father and unexpectedly asked him if he did not want to sell his daughter. He advised Wam to stop playing the caring father. Horatio also looked at Tara's father and added that his cheap lies won't fool anyone, so let him stop playing cheap comedy here. Drops of cold sweat appeared on Valma's forehead. He didn't even know what to say to such a straightforward and strict prince. He only said that he would never sell his own daughter. But Horatio was already tired of listening to such stupid talk and hypocrisy of the man. Therefore, he said that he was tired of all this and advised Valma to find another husband for his daughter. Horatio rose from his throne and prepared to go somewhere. Saltus, frightened, asked him what he was doing because they were not supposed to leave their month of honor at the festival. But Horatio calmly replied that he was simply protecting what rightfully belonged to him personally. Finally, he wished everyone present a good evening and left. Horatio, of course, went to his beloved's room. Moreover, he heard the voice of the valet asking for help. But when Horatio got to the door, he noticed a magic that muffles the sound. Of course, this did not stop the brave prince, and he stepped on the edge of the magic spell. But when he opened the door, what he saw there surprised him. An unconscious nymph lay on the floor near the door. At first, Horatio thought she had been killed, but then he noticed that she had simply drunk herself to the point of losing her pulse. At the same time, his beloved Radiana and the valet were having fun. They were sitting on the windowsill, drinking alcoholic beverages and talking cheerfully about something. Horatio's eyes also popped out of his forehead, because he did not expect to see such a wedding here. He loudly called his bride's name. Radiana at the same time returned to the prince. There was a red blush on the girl's face, which clearly indicated that the girl was drunk. Her eyes generally looked in different directions. She shouted joyfully that at last His Highness had come to them. Horatio was not happy with what he saw. The young girl immediately decided to approach the prince. As she began to approach, Horatio said that he was not in the mood for drunken shenanigans, so they should wait to talk. But Radiana replied that she was the most sober of all sober people. When Radiana approached her prince, something happened with the coordination of movements, and she lost her balance and collapsed on Horatio's shoulder. She painfully pressed her cheek against His Highness. Radiana rubbed her cheek with her hand and said that she now had another bruise, exactly where the previous one was. But she was not in pain. Even a smile appeared on her face. Then the drunk Radiana looked into her fiancé's eyes and said that she liked Horatio very much, and there was nothing she could do about it. Of course, her brain didn't want to say that, but her drunken tongue did its thing. Horatio softened at once, for she had never told the prince of her feelings. He approached her, hugged her tenderly, and said that of course it was true. Then he looked into her eyes and asked her to tell him not to be. He was ready to listen to her drunken chatter for an eternity, because they were like healing balm on his heart. His hands reached for her golden hair and sank into it. He smelled her again, and his whole body was filled with sensations. An unbearable desire to hug her tighter played in the blood. He took her in his arms. Her heart was beating fast, and he felt every beat of her heart. His lips leaned over her ear, and he whispered to her not to stop, but to tell him more. When Horatio brought his beloved to his room, he also poured himself a glass of wine. He also did not forget about Radiana, although he understood that the young girl had more than enough alcohol for today. He looked at Radiana and told her to tell about her life on Earth. The young girl held the glass tightly in her hand and collected her thoughts. Then Radiana drank it all down to gather courage to tell the story. While she was silent, Horatio watched carefully and said that so far the story was not very interesting. He wanted to understand her way of thinking and better understand the girl herself. Meanwhile, she ventured to begin her story and said that the master of the slaves beat her whenever he pleased. Radiana closed her eyes and remembered all the horrors that happened to her in the past. A chill ran through the skin, because those beatings happened every day. Her skin still remembered everything well. She said that sometimes her master beat her for making baskets that were too strong, and sometimes for making them too weak. He always didn't like it, and looked for the slightest excuse to vent his anger. Radiana counted the days he hadn't touched her, and counted only 9 days. These were simply incredibly fabulous days when her body did not feel the touch of gossip. Horatio looked at the young girl with displeasure. He only heard her complain about being beaten, although he actually thought he heard something else when he asked her to tell him something. Radiana could no longer contain her emotions, and tears rolled down her red tears like hail. She felt sorry for herself and sad, and it hurt to remember all the abuse she had to go through. But then she suddenly opened her eyes and looked at the prince. She shouted loudly in the prince's face why he didn't save her. Horatio almost dropped the glass from his hands. He was simply shocked by such claims of his beloved, and asked what exactly she had in mind when she dared to present such a thing to him. She looked directly at him and continued that he was the sun god, but he wasn't around when Radiana needed saving. Why then did he appear when she wanted to die? She screamed right into his face that she was constantly calling out to the gods for help. Every day she begged to be saved, and even when the monsters pushed her and cut her clothes. Then Radiana completely lost control over her emotions and slammed her fist into Horatio's chest with all her might. She shouted, "Did he ever think about the people who needed his help?" She boldly looked at the prince and continued that he was probably quite busy enjoying the prayers of greedy people at such times. Radiana could no longer contain her anger and fell on Horatio's chest. She sobbed and said that he must have sneezed at the pain and suffering of the people who begged for salvation. Horatio did not know how to respond to Radiana's claims. Therefore, he simply listened silently to what the young girl wanted to convey to him. Then he took her by the shoulders and put her in place. He loudly told her to stop throwing tantrums because the alcohol was doing all the talking for her. Radiana regained consciousness and looked at Horatio. Tears glistened in the girl's eyes. She looked at him and asked what he did when he appeared in her life. When he appeared just at the moment when the young girl was almost not burned, and only the drunk valet and the nymph had nothing to do with the family quarrels of the hot couple. They both slept peacefully, after drinking alcohol, and must have seen something pleasant in their dreams. But Radiana didn't even think of stopping. She decided to dot the dots once and for all. Therefore, without waiting for Horatio's answer, she prayed for him that he called her his thing and condemned her to eternal life. She was at the height of her emotions, so she poked her finger at Horatio and shouted loudly how he could call himself God after all this. But Horatio was no longer going to tolerate such an attitude towards him, so he quickly grabbed her hand and pulled her to him. He understood that she was just drunk. That's why she gained extra courage. His head was already very close to his beloved. Radiana instantly melted, and not a trace of her previous courage remained. He leaned over her and softly whispered what she wanted now. Radiana did not understand the question and asked what exactly he meant. Horatio patiently repeated what the girl wanted from him at the moment. Radiana looked at the prince in surprise, and he repeated once more that the girl should say her most cherished wish, and he would fulfill it. The surprised girl took her hand away from the prince and sternly asked him what the meaning of this would be. She still had a lot to say to Horatio, but she wondered if she should do it right now. She said that Prince Horatio made her immortal, even though she didn't want it at all, and now her energy flows inside her body. But then the full value of his words reached Radiana. She looked at him and asked if he had lied to her that he would do anything she asked right now. Horatio sat solemnly in his chair and loudly announced to the whole room that the gods never lie, so she could ask absolutely anything. Radiana's face showed that she hesitated to tell the truth, and Horatio at that moment was going through the options of what his beloved would say in his head. But Radiana gathered courage, clenched her hands into fists, and shouted that what she wanted most in her life now was to become free. Tears flowed from her eyes again, and she asked why she could not have the freedom that others have. The girl fell to her knees before His Highness and continued to sob. She put her hands on his knees and begged him to fulfill her request, otherwise she would wither and die. A tearful Radiana also added that she does not want to be old forever. Horatio tried to reassure his beloved and said that it is not worth worrying about because it will not happen. But Radiana could no longer stop herself and shouted that she had the strength, that she just wanted to enjoy life, and the role of a doll did not suit her at all, so she asked to fulfill her wishes. Horatio thought for a moment. He was very surprised by Radiana's wish. Why exactly she asked for freedom, he never understood. He could give her the whole world, but she asked for some freedom. He thought that Radiana would wish for gold, lands, or respect among other noble families. At the very least, he hoped to hear that Radiana would seek revenge on those who had abused her for so long, or on those who had given her up to certain death. But his beloved did not care about all these values. She only wanted to be free. He looked at the crying Radiana, who was kneeling in front of him and begging only for freedom. Horatio thought a little and said that his beloved would certainly get what she asked for because he had already promised her. Radiana looked at Horatio in surprise for a few minutes. She couldn't believe what she just heard. After all, it was her most cherished dream. So she screamed with joy. Immediately, her expression changed, and she began cheerfully telling her prince what she planned to do as soon as she was free. She was going to go to distant forests. Radiana planned to settle where there were many trees. Then he will arrange a small house and collect berries in a basket that he will weave with his own hands. And every day after lunch, she will definitely go to the ocean. After all, its waters should give her a sense of freedom. In her dreams, Radiana very often imagined this incredible sight so realistically that it was as if she'd been going on such walks for a long time. Radiana looked at Orazio and added that the ocean she had seen was incredibly beautiful. Radiana fell on her knees to Horatio and hugged him tenderly. She was grateful to him for such a gift, which she had not even dreamed of. Horatio quietly asked if he could just give her that ocean. He looked at his beloved and waited for an answer. That girl said that why own the waters? She only wants to peacefully enjoy them in her free and peaceful life. Horatio looked at his beloved Radiana and could not help but admire her beauty and purity. For the first time in his life, Horatio felt his mask crack into hundreds of small pieces. Horatio gently took his Radiana in his arms and, taking his time, went to bed. Holding this mortal woman in his arms, he caught himself thinking that he could no longer imagine his life without her. As if a fragile, precious treasure, Horatio placed the girl on the bedspread and looked at his beauty. Her reproaches for not saving her when it was so necessary still echoed in his head. Having taken a glass of wine, Horatio sat down on the sofa and, as if making excuses, thought that in fact he could not hear her prayers because Radiana addressed them to the god of the sun, Solo. Even though Horatio was a sun prince, in reality he was still the ruler of the dark lands of Tesca, and the desperate prayers of the people did not reach Horatio's ears at all. Horatio was well aware that he existed only to maintain the balance of their Povius, and his direct duty in this life is only to kill, and everyone considers him only the god of death. Horatio looked at the glass of wine, where he saw his reflection in the red light, and mentally turned to Radiana, asking if she knew that he had been covering his hands with blood for centuries. But now was not the best time to think about one's fate. Therefore, Horatio decided to wake up the valet, because he had a rather good idea that Gino could handle like no one else. Gino barely opened his eyes after a good drunkenness and could not figure out what happened to him. Meanwhile, the stern voice of Horatio, who told the valet to go to El Diego, brought him back to reality. Gino barely realized what Horatio was asking of him. The prince hastened to explain that he wanted to know all the information about what kind of life Radiana had spent in the mortal world in recent years. Horatio didn't want to admit that he couldn't read her mind, so he had to find out about her life in another way. Out loud, Horatio only said that the lifespan of mortals is much shorter and the valet must hurry. The valet just managed to object that it is not necessary to send him to the world of mortals because of Radiana's drunken chatter, because the sufferings of all slaves are the same. But Horatio sternly remarked that Radiana was no longer a slave. Horatio added that Radiana now belongs to him, and therefore he is not going to watch her suffering and wants to understand what she went through on Earth. Gino could not understand anything from the words of Prince Horatio. The valet considered Horatio's request and asked him to think again before making such a risky decision, since the last time the gods intervened in the lives of mortals was 1,000 years ago. Gino reminded him that even His Highness Saul kept as far away from people as possible and did not in any way interfere in their affairs, even when they begged him in their prayers. All the more, Gino was worried that this act could be seen as a rebellion against Horatio's own father, the sun god Saul, and this will be like the first step in the beginning of a bloody war. The valet also added that killing a couple of people will not save Radiana from nightmares, so it is worth thinking about other ways of punishing thieves and not going to such drastic measures. But Horatio was adamant in his decision and ordered Gino to go to the ground immediately. The valet finally said that the problems in heaven are very much like knots in a thread that will eventually become impossible to untie. The valet told Horatio to remember these words well and disappear, dissolving into the air. Horatio thought about it, but he wasn't going to change his mind, so he went to the window and looked at the festive fireworks. For himself, Horatio decided that if it was not too late, he wanted to be to Radiana the god whom she so called in her prayers when she needed help, living among mortals. Meanwhile, somewhere on the edge of Ella Diego's arena, a man arrived at Stella's chambers, bowed and asked what he owed such close attention from the honorable lady. Lying on the sofa was a pretty girl with red hair named Stella, smoking a cigar and looking at the man who had come into her room. She invited him to come closer, because she was already waiting for him. When the man asked why the lady called such a simple trader like him to her, the girl slyly looked into his eyes and said that she heard that he had a rather interesting poison. After these words, the merchant turned pale and swallowed nervously. That girl quickly pacified the man, saying that she wanted to buy the poison and it would not harm the merchant. Stella then gave the man a cold look and said that she would only use this poison if the slave stopped obeying her. The merchant meant that he did not doubt the honorable lady's noble intentions. Stella noted that he was quite an intelligent man and asked for a price. Their conversation was interrupted by a maid who ran into the rooms. The maid quickly told that Mr. Electus had started another fight. Stella quickly got out of bed and said that somehow she was not at all surprised by this news. But the maid quickly added that Mr. Electus had killed a man in this fight. Stila coldly told the maid to convey to him that she was not interested in his male antics. And then Stila looked at the merchant and said that if he came to her with an offer to buy poison, then she would buy it on behalf of Electus, because one day this poison would have to be tested on him. Then Stila ordered the maid to pay the gossipers who would tell that Electus had become addicted to dope and began to think of himself as the son of Unicus Mundus, the high priest of the empire. The red-haired girl ordered to be left alone as she needed to rest. She thought to herself that she didn't start managing affairs in the arena in order to cover the tracks of this bastard. Therefore, Stila decided that very soon Alicus would find out where his true place was, and it was necessary to get rid of the man who was causing her so much unnecessary trouble as soon as possible. Stila quickly went to the balcony, looked at the gladiators who were fighting in the arena, and loudly shouted that she was looking for a lucky person who would warm her passionately in bed today. When the sun's rays finally woke up the sleepy Radiana, they barely opened her eyes, and she felt that her head was just splitting with pain. Therefore, she touched her forehead with her hand, trying to gather it into a pile. Then the young girl felt someone's gaze, and looking up, saw that Horatio was sitting over her bed, who did not take his eyes off her. Radiana asked how long he had been in her room. Radiana immediately pulled the sheet over herself and looked at the room, which was in complete disarray, as if a drunken party had been held here all night. While the young lady was recalling what had happened here, Horatio asked her if she really did not remember anything about last night and everything that happened here after a few glasses of wine. Only then did Radiana partially regain her memory, and she remembered how she and Gino had gotten pretty drunk, and then she told the prince everything she thought about him. After these memories, she blushed from head to toe. Radiana tried to tell Horatio that she could explain everything, but he only smiled, and putting a silver thread in her hand, said that she would hardly be able to enjoy the festival today, so she should rest. Radiana was very grateful that he had stepped into her position, and she would not have to play the role of a nymph among the gods at the festival. But before she had time to thank him, he instantly disappeared from her room. Radiana looked confusedly into the void when she was brought back to reality by the voice of Nika, who apologized for what had happened because she thought that it was all happening because of her. The maid explained that Horatio, as usual, appeared out of nowhere, and she had only to hide behind the bed so that the prince would not notice her, because she was very afraid of his unpredictable nature. Radiana tried to remember the details of the previous evening and to understand whether she did not have time to make a fool of herself, because she did not remember anything after the second glass of wine. But only fragments of their conversation appeared in my head. Suddenly, there was a knock in the room, and it was reported that guests had come to Lady Radiana. The nymph and the young girl looked at each other, and Radiana asked in surprise who could have visited her. Nika told Radiana not to worry, because she will go now and find out about everything. When Nika went out the door, she saw several beautiful goddesses and asked them what they could do to help them. One of the goddesses noted that they had met Prince Horatio's lover the previous night, so they had come to personally thank her for her kindness, and noted that Nika was speaking rather rudely to them. Nika replied that she had to leave the distinguished guest for a moment and asked them to wait. And she herself ran as fast as possible into Radiana's room and closed the door tightly so that no one would enter before time. Radiana was not jokingly scared and asked who had scared her nymph so much. Nika shouted that they don't have time to talk and they urgently need to get Radiana in shape. A few minutes later, the well-dressed Radiana was sitting on a chair and holding a collection of poems in her hands. She was ready to meet the aristocratic women of Povius who came to visit her. The aristocrats who entered the room remarked that Radiana looked rather fragile compared to the gods, and were surprised that Horatio chose her as his first wife. The goddesses noticed that Radiana was interested in quite adult literature, and then they noticed a melted stove in the room and asked Radiana what kind of strange equipment it was. While the nymph tried to come up with some excuse, Radiana honestly replied that they were tools for making silver jewelry. One of the goddesses said in surprise that probably the rumors turned out to be true, and Radiana had indeed created a silver ornament for the sun god at yesterday's festival. Radiana confirmed that this was all true, and that she had learned this skill from Mr. Magus. The girl also added that in fact, this class turned out to be much more difficult than she had imagined. Radiana also noted that without such masters, ladies would not have such beautiful jewelry made of precious metals. One of the goddesses asked about the ornament that was woven into Radiana's hair. Radiana said that this silver lily was made for her by Mr. Magus, and if the goddesses wanted, she could try to make silver jewelry for them as well. The aristocrats clapped their hands and said that it would be very nice, because it would be quite imprudent of them to refuse such a rare decoration. Therefore, the goddesses surrounded Radiana, and in advance asked her to make some kind of jewelry from precious metal for them as well. One of the aristocrats noted that Mr. Magus had stopped his activity of making jewelry, so it was quite a rarity at the moment, and the goddesses were happy that Magus had taken Radiana as an apprentice. At first, Radiana set about making jewelry, and then she remembered that she had to work with fire, and therefore ran the risk of getting burned, which could betray her human origin. Shrewd Radiana asked the nymphs for help and asked Nika to give her the black pearls. A few minutes later, a beautiful bracelet with the image of a dolphin was admired in Radiana's hands. Radiana handed the ornament to one of the aristocrats and said that the pearl would suit the girl very well, and the ornament in the form of a dolphin, which symbolizes the god Bacchus, would bring the girl constant luck. When Radiana asked if she liked the decoration, the aristocrat, carefully examining it, said that, to be honest, she had never seen such fine and exquisite work until today. A frightened father ran into Tara's bedroom and shouted, asking what she was going to do about it, because Avarsha had given part of their family land to another family. Tara could not yet wake up properly, and therefore did not understand what was being discussed. And the father continued to shout that if things continued in the same spirit, they would soon be begging on the outskirts of Povius. Tara immediately remembered the threats of Avarithia, who assured, not jokingly, that the fate of the Piros family was in the hands of Tara herself. It depends on her whether this family will be lost in history or continue its existence. Confused, Tara asked if her father had told her mother the news. He shouted that after hearing that, his mother refused to get out of bed and talk to his sister Avarisha. The father angrily shouted for Tara to go immediately and apologize to Horatio and his nymphs. And if you need to become the prince's concubine in order to return the lands, then Tara should agree to that as well. Tara angrily shouted that she was not going to become a concubine because she belonged to the rather powerful family of Pyros, and no matter what, she was still a goddess. The father noted that Her Highness Avarisha is a rather cruel and spiteful woman, so she should only wish, and the entire family on Tara's paternal line may disappear forever from the heavenly Olympus. Leaving the room, the father shouted that Prince Horatio agreed to take Tara as a concubine, so she must do everything to save herself and their family from certain death. Alone in the room, Tara reflected that her plans to marry Horatio had failed, and she could not believe that one happy night spent in the royal garden could end like this. At first, Tara thought to say that this child, which she carries under her heart, is from Caligua, because everyone knew about his love affairs. But his exile prevented the realization of this ingenious plan. Meanwhile, Her Highness Avarisha was persistently implementing her plan, according to which Tara was to betroth Prince Horatio as soon as possible and bind their families together with strong bonds. Then Tara decided that it didn't matter which of the crown princes she would marry. The main thing for her was that her child was recognized as the heir to the throne. Tara could not even imagine that the half-blood Prince Horatio would dare to refuse the pure-blood goddess of their empire. Therefore, she had to take Rhinum pills for now. The goddess regularly took Rhinum because it delayed the development of her fetus, and this woman needed time to implement her plan. She decided that everyone underestimated her, which she would later regret. Tara decided that although Horatio was a judge on God's Olympus, he still remained a demigod, so the time would surely come when he himself would ask Tara to marry him. The valet immediately began to carry out Horatio's order and went to the ground. But as soon as he got there, the human stench disturbed him, and he was already dreaming when his mission would come to an end. Gino searched for the overseer of the slaves, based on Radiana's drunken description, but all searches were in vain, so he no longer hoped to find anything. Suddenly, a man approached him and asked what he was doing here. Then the valet decided that this was his chance and asked the man how long he had been working as a slave trader. The man thought about it, and after counting, said that he was somewhere around 30 years old. Then Gino said he had one request. The man immediately noticed that he was approached for one reason, namely to get rid of some disobedient slave, and in this he has no equal. The slave trader was glad that he had to deal with a respectable person and assured the valet that he would solve any of his problems. But Gino replied that his request was different. Gino looked the slaver in the eyes and asked if he had ever met a slave girl named Radiana. He thought and seemed to try to remember something. And then the man exclaimed that the valet probably meant a naughty girl with purple eyes and blonde hair. Gino was happy and said that it was this girl he had in mind, and decided in his mind that his search was not in vain, and he finally managed to find the very place he had been looking for so long. But the man was in no hurry to tell about Radiana, and only mysteriously said that not only this slave, but also her mother were quite expensive. Then, narrowing his eyes, he looked at the valet. Gino was calmly waiting for the information that interested him, and therefore the man decided not only to hint, but also to extend his hand to the valet, saying that this information will not be shared for nothing. Gino tossed the coin purse into the man's hand, who then told him that there were rumors that Radiana was the illegitimate child of one of the El Diego nobles, and that Radiana's mother was endowed with divine powers. The man said that Radiana's mother survived in Khrushchev only thanks to the priest Unicus, and no one dared to lay a finger on the former priestess, who was also related to the high priest of the sun god. And Radiana became even more famous after Gracia visited her one day in her own person. After a short conversation with Radiana, Gracia took the girl with her to her estate. The valet immediately suspected something was wrong, because why would the daughter of the high priest of the sun god take a slave with her? Gino could not understand this yet, but Gino had great doubts about Gracia's sincere intentions. The man said that few people liked Gracia's prank, but no one dared to argue with her. Here, he was called by another slave trader, and the man said that he had an important conversation. Another slave trader exclaimed that even the memories made him sick, because no matter how much he beat Radiana and left her tied up in the barn, she still managed to slip out of their hands. The slave trader also added that it was necessary to finish off Radiana before Grazia took her, and they both burst into a creepy laugh. Even Gino, who had seen a lot at his age, felt a little uneasy about it. Listening to the conversations of the slave traders, Gino understood why Horatia had sent him to Earth, because if the prince had come here in person, the entire Diego Empire would have burned to the ground in 1 second. And when the men asked the valet what had interested him so much in this slave, Gino decided not to mess with these scum anymore and, using magical power, proceeded to punish them. The ground under the men turned into some kind of swamp, which began to suck them deeper and deeper. Frightened men screamed and called for help, but no one was in a hurry to save them. Gino looked at the men with only the top of their heads left and thought that Lady Radiana had been through a lot while she was in this horrible place. Then the valet noticed that the hungry slaves who remained here could even move from hunger and gave them fragrant bread. Gino decided that His Highness would understand his concession. After that, the valet decided to visit the high priest Eladius, and finding his luxurious palace, thought that the solution to the sacrifice of Radiana was contained right here. Meanwhile, the celebration of the festival continued in the palace of Povius, to which Vicaria Lumen came, which was announced loudly to all those present at the festival. The young woman also greeted His Highness the sun god Sol, and asked permission to present to him the first child of his son Saltus. The sun god allowed Vicaria to come closer, and said that news had reached him that the labor had begun even before the festival. The vicar smiled and said that it was so, and when Vicaria approached her husband, he hugged her tenderly and thanked her for giving their son life. She replied that she should not be thanked for it, because it was their common desire. Avaricia carefully examined the child held by the sun god, and noted that the baby's hair was the same color as his father's, to which the sun god only smiled with satisfaction. But then, Avaricia suddenly turned her attention to Horatio, and said loudly that it would be very nice if the prince would announce to everyone present exactly when his wedding would take place. Sol also turned his attention to his son, and asked him out loud why he wasn't sharing his plans for a future life with Terra, because he would like to hear about it as well. Horatio bowed, greeted the sun god, and said that his father would be the first to know about it. Avaricia was stunned by the politeness of her disobedient son. Therefore, Avaricia decided to say out loud that she was glad that Horatio had finally come to his senses, because Terra was very worried about the unfortunate incident that happened yesterday at the festival. But Horatio only smiled with satisfaction, and looking into the eyes of the Empress, said that Terra's father was also worried about this unfortunate incident, so he was already coming to Horatio with a conversation. Avaricia was alarmed by such a message, and she asked whether Valmconium had really come to Horatio, and the prince noted that this man was also quite impatient. And finally, Prince Horatio added that the reason for the conversation was Terra's father's request that she become Horatio's concubine. After that, those present in the hall immediately began to whisper, discussing this news. Avarisha barely restrained herself from fury, and just blurted out through her teeth that how could he imagine that a lady from the treacherous family would become a concubine, and that already goes beyond all the boundaries of decency. Then the empress shouted that a pure-blood woman from a noble family could not be a concubine a priori. The god of the sun, seeing that the woman was boiling, put his hand on her shoulder so that she would not make a fool of herself at the festival. Emperor Solo asked Horatio what he meant by saying such things, and Horatio only curtly replied that he was simply giving these people what they had so desperately asked for. Horatio then said that a demigod would not interfere with the celebration of the birth of a pureblood boy, and so he must bow and leave the banquet hall. Leaving the banquet hall, Horatio reminded that Tara had very little time left, because patience is not his best side, so the pureblood goddess should hurry. Tara also decided not to sit in her room and visit that cursed nymph, who, like a bone across her throat, stood in the way of such brilliant plans of Tara. Wearing her best outfit, she went out into the world. Walking through the corridors, Tara noticed everyone gossiping about the latest events. Of course, she expected that only a lazy person would not discuss the victory of a simple nymph over an aristocrat. But even more, Tara worried about her fate as a concubine in Horatio's estate and wanted to turn this situation to her advantage to avoid such disgrace. As she walked past the three aristocrats, Tara noticed them examining something and asked aloud what they were doing there. The girls looked scared at Tara and greeted the goddess. The aristocrats asked what Tara was doing here, and she said that she was going to visit the stupid nymph, because she thought that after yesterday's incident she would come to apologize herself and did not wait for that. Tara also added that she would like to know if the nymph regrets what happened, and therefore, as the First Lady of Povius, she decided to personally ask Radiana if she was going to apologize. Tara saw that aristocratic women were not behaving as usual and were hiding something, and when she looked at them more closely, she noticed that they had an ornament similar to the one made by Mr. Magus. Tara shouted indignantly, asking how they could acquire this ornament, knowing full well that she had searched the entire empire to get the ornament from the Magus, and had never found anything. The aristocrats knew how angry Tara was, so they decided not to annoy her even more, and apologized guiltily for having the ornament, but added that Mr. Magus had not made it. Tara yelled that she was good at jewelry, so don't fool her. Then Tara overheard the two noblewomen discussing that the girl had good taste and was worthy of being the prince's chosen one. Tara angrily asked where they were coming from and noted that they were like those bats flying from one side to another, because until recently they supported the goddess. And while the aristocrat was apologizing and trying to explain that it was just a misunderstanding, Tara could not contain her rage and hit her so that the girl flew back. Tara shouted angrily, asking if the aristocrat would dare to repeat this in front of His Highness. The girl was lying on the floor and did not dare to say anything, while Tara, meanwhile, moved on. On the way, she shouted that it was time to teach that damned nymph a lesson not to poke her nose into Tara's personal space, because until today, no one had allowed herself to do that. Meanwhile, a whole crowd of aristocratic women had formed near Radiana's room, who also wanted to get a rare piece of jewelry. Nika tried to organize these women somehow and invited them one by one. The aristocrats said in advance that they had been waiting here for a long time and wanted Nika to take them out of the queue. The nymph decided that their work today was not going to end as quickly as they had planned. Nika entered the room and asked Radiana what they should do now, because the girls are not going to end, but are added more and more. And Nika has already lost count of how many of them came here. Radiana, who was absorbed in work, looked at Nika and said that her words filled her heart with joy, and she would be happy to give each girl some kind of jewelry. Nika could not understand why Radiana agreed to make a decoration for each of the aristocrats who wanted to, because at this moment she should have been enjoying the compliments at the festival. And due to the fact that Radiana spent almost the entire festival in her room, now no one recognizes her as a nymph. And for this, Horatio can decapitate Nick, which, of course, she worried about. Then the girls heard the announcement that the sun god was inviting everyone to celebrate the birth of his grandson. Nika was finally glad that they had an opportunity to rest, and said that they should tidy up. No sooner had Nick and Radian closed the door than they were informed that an important guest had come to Lady Radian, and the girls froze in place, not believing their eyes when they saw who entered their room. Lady Tara entered the room, and it became clear from her appearance that the mood of the goddess was completely bad, and it was not worth counting on the fact that she came just to say hello. The nymph decided that now was not the best time to find out about the relationship, so they stepped forward and, smiling, said that unfortunately now was not the best time, and Lady Radiana could not receive guests. But Tara wasn't going to back down. She shouted that she knew very well that thanks to her silly abilities, Radiana had won the hearts of the aristocratic women of Povius, making them jewelry. And then, with all her strength, Tara pushed Nika so that the nymph flew away and fell to the floor. The goddess said loudly that when she had already arrived, she should be greeted as the First Lady of Povius. Radiana screamed as Tara hit Nika, and Tara, meanwhile, said that Radiana's maid should teach her maid a lesson, which, of course, Radiana herself wouldn't mind doing. Tara angrily yelled that Radiana must think she's special if Horatio let her warm his bed, but Radiana was, and still is, a useless nymph. Tara then angrily asked what the hell Radiana was letting herself look into her eyes. Radiana replied firmly that His Highness had told her to look her opponent in the eye when speaking. Tara did not expect that this worthless nymph would say anything to her, and shouted how she dared to be rude to the goddess Povius for no reason. But Radiana was not going to be silent any longer, so she also said in a raised tone that in her opinion it was Tara who behaved rudely with Radiana and the maids present here. Tara could no longer contain herself, so she swung and cried out, asking how a nymph could be so defiant towards a pureblood lady, and therefore deserve a decent punishment for it. Nika saw that Tara swung and would have hit Radiana in a moment, so she quickly got up from the floor and blocked the girl with herself. Tara's entire blow landed on Nika's cheek. Radiana immediately hugged her maid and asked how she was feeling, because she saw that there was a bruise on Nika's cheek. Although it did not upset Tara in the slightest. Radiana shouted, asking Tara what she was doing, because the nymph was not guilty of anything, and no one has the right to treat her like this. But Tara defiantly replied that this was the fault of the nymph herself, and that for the fact that she tried to interfere with the goddess, death would be the best punishment for her. Tara then added that after all, serving a worthless nymph like Radiana was a good punishment for a handmaiden, even if death was the best. Radiana couldn't even fathom how much anger this goddess could hold, so she yelled that if Tara got better from this, she could hit Radiana too. Radiana boldly moved closer to Tara, and looking into her eyes, repeated that the goddess could strike Radiana if she felt better after that, and eventually let go of them. Radiana shouted for Tara to beat her with all her might, but remembered only that if Horatio asked what happened to Radiana, she would tell him the whole truth and ask him to cut off Tara's hand. Tara couldn't calm down and shouted that no foolish nymph could threaten the goddess Povius, so she wouldn't ask her permission if she wanted to strike her. But Radiana only demanded that Tara apologize to Nika for hitting her for no reason. And if Tara really sincerely apologizes, then Radiana promised her to forget about what happened here. Stunned, Tara kept her eyes on Radiana, for she had never seen the nymph so angry. Of course, Tara was afraid of Horatio's reaction because she didn't want any problems with him. Nika felt quite uncomfortable that such powerful women in their empire were fighting over her, so she said that she was fine and that Terry didn't need to apologize to her. But Radiana insisted on an apology, because she understood that if she left the situation unchecked, it would happen again, and she would have to forget about a peaceful life in Povius. So, Radiana threatened Terry that she would lose her arm if she didn't apologize. After all, Radiana was not going to forgive such a bold behavior on the part of the goddess a second time. These words angered Tara even more, and she decided to spank Radiana so that she remembered her place for the rest of her life. But just as Tara raised her hand, she felt someone grab her tightly. It was Prince Horatio in person. He looked at Radiana and said in a calm tone that he had no idea that Radiana wanted Tara's hand in marriage and should have been told about it earlier. Surprised, Radiana just blinked and looked gratefully at Horatio. She was more than ever glad that he appeared on time, and now she would not have to defend herself against Tara's attacks. Everything inside Tara went cold, and she even squatted down in surprise. She looked at Horatio with frightened eyes and realized that her act today would not go unpunished. Horatio glared at Tara and sternly said that he was not repeating his warnings twice, so Tara would not have another chance, and she must answer for her behavior today. Horatio added that he would not have to wait for a pardon, because this was not his strong character trait. After these words, Tara felt a terrible pain in her arm and saw blood splash on her dress. Tara screamed in pain and called for help. but Horatio remarked that he guessed that Tara had been taking rhenium, but it was unlikely to help her today. Horatio shouted that this was the price of Tara's cruelty, who tried to raise a hand on what belonged to Prince Horatio, and he was not going to forgive anyone like that. Tara begged for mercy and tried to explain that she was not guilty of anything, but Horatio rudely replied that the place of a concubine in his Terry estate should be forgotten forever. And then Horatio embraced Radiana tenderly and said that they must hurry, for the celebration of the birth of Saltus's child was about to begin, and they could not be late. Sometimes, on the ship, two men were discussing the new captain over a glass of beer. And his good looks are special, which could not be resisted by any girl who happened to see him. Men also said that this captain was surrounded only by beauties. Suddenly, a well-dressed man entered the cabin, before whom they fell on their knees, greeting him. The man sat down at the table and quickly told the waiter to bring him a glass of wine immediately. The waiter quickly ran to carry out the order of the respectable man. Meanwhile, the voice of a man named Electus was heard, who was put behind bars. Electus screamed for him to be released immediately, as he wasn't going to let this go unpunished once he got out of here. The man with white hair asked the waiter why they locked that Electus behind bars. The waiter said that Electus drank almost all of their alcohol supply and also killed his companion. Therefore, they had to somehow take care of their safety and locked him behind bars. The waiter also added that the man must have lost his mind because he constantly repeats that he is the son of the high priest Eunuchus. The man ordered Electus to be brought here so that he could comfort them somehow. Radiana was in such a hurry to get away from Tara as soon as possible that she could not even think carefully about Horatio's proposal and immediately agreed to prepare for the celebration of the birth of Saltus's child. It wasn't until Radiana found herself in the bathroom with a half-naked Horatio that she realized what he was talking about was washing her with his own hands. But now there was no way back for her. Now that they were alone, Radiana said that she did not want to fight with Tara at all, and Radiana did not need her hand at all, so she asked Horatio not to be angry with the goddess and not to punish her. Horatio leaned closer to his Radiana and said that he was tired of repeating that he hated it when people touched with their hands what belonged only to him, and for this he was not going to forgive anyone. Horatio touched his hand to Radiana's cheek, and from this touch, goosebumps ran through her body, and a treacherous blush appeared on her face again. The girl could no longer think of anyone but the Sun Prince. By chance, His Highness noticed that the skin on Radiana's hand was injured, and asked her what had happened. She immediately began to make excuses that she was just working with silver and did not notice how it happened. Horatio noticed that the girl had some pretty good excuses for any of his claims, and I thought to myself that I shouldn't have given her silver threads for making jewelry, but on the other hand, Horatio understood that he was a deity, and it would be quite ugly to refuse his words, so he had no other choice than to let Radiana make the jewelry. Radiana looked guiltily at her hand, and whispered that he himself allowed her to work with silver, to which Horatio remarked that he did not allow her to mutilate herself. His Highness began to gently wipe Radiana's dirty hands, and the blushing girl asked the Sunny Prince why he was so kind and attentive to her. But Horatio had only one answer to all the questions, which was that from the day the girl was given to him as a sacrifice, Radiana became his property, which he was not going to give up. Horatio gently kissed Radiana's hand and said that anyone who touches her will die in the same minute, and reminded the young girl that the festival is not over yet. And then Horatio said that the lives of Gino and Nika depended entirely on whether the gods would believe that Radiana was a nymph, and it depended on him, in turn, whether he would spare her life. Meanwhile, in Avaricia's room, Terry slapped her hard and screamed, asking how the girl dared to bleed in Horatio's presence, thereby revealing her delicate condition to the world. The Empress shouted in displeasure that she had spent an incredible amount of rhinum on Tara, and it was all in vain. And because of her impatience, all their plans went awry, and Avaricia generally doubted Tara's favor. Tara couldn't hold back her tears for losing a child in the incident, and told Avaricia that she felt sorry for her unborn baby who never got to see the world. Avaricia cruelly grabbed Tara by the hair and, shaking her, shouted loudly that no one cared at all about the fate of that bastard. All the more so because he only created extra trouble for everyone. Avaricia shouted that how could stupid Terry think of deceiving Judge Horatio when everyone knows that he can see through the eyes of those around him and can read their minds. And then the Empress called her servants to seize Tara and throw her into the cave to the satyrs. After hearing that, everything went cold inside the girl because she knew that no one was coming back from there. Tara begged her Aunt Avarisha to forgive her because Tara's future life now depended on her, and she understood that the Empress could torture her without even blinking an eye. Tara understood that only if she was useful, Avarisha could pardon her, and therefore, remembering the last events, she informed the Empress that she saw dried blood on Radiana's hand. Tara added that this blood was human. Avarisha, approaching the girl, angrily asked if she was completely out of her mind, saying such nonsense, trying to save her own skin. Tara assured that the blood was red, and if Radiana was really a nymph, her blood would be green. Tara could have sworn that the hands of Horatio's chosen one were covered in human blood. Avarisha froze in surprise and began to consider Tara's words. Then she said that if what she said was true, then the whole story was getting more and more interesting. Tara begged her aunt for mercy and promised not to interfere with her plans anymore. Avarisha ordered the servants to lock up her niece in the estate and not let her out anywhere for her personal orders. As she left the room, Avarisha thought that if Tara was right, she could make Horatio a traitor and accuse him of breaking the laws of the heavenly Olympus. Avarisha laughed at the thought of Horatio bringing a human girl to heaven and decided that this was a very good opportunity to upset the balance of celestial life. The Empress pondered this shocking news for a long time and ordered her maids to immediately call Kamolo to her to find out if a person had really made their way to them. Kamolo was a court magician, and as soon as he entered Avarisha's chambers, she immediately informed him that she had learned information that Prince Horatio's first wife was human. But Kamolo could not believe these words and denied Avarisha, saying that even Saul recognized this lady as a real nymph. The Empress agreed that Radiana had created a silver ornament for the Emperor. Avarisha also added that Horatio and his wife tried to have everyone around their finger. But everyone knows that silver can also obey people, so Radianima could easily handle it. Kimolo thought about the Empress's words and agreed that she was right. Avarisha mused aloud, saying that Sol must have guessed right away that Radiana was human and didn't tell anyone about it, obviously not wanting to divulge the secret. Therefore, the Empress came to the conclusion that only two beings knew about the fact that Radiana is actually a person, the sun god Sol himself and the sun prince Horatio. Avarisha immediately remembered how 2 centuries ago, a woman with dark hair and eyes, with which Horatio himself now looks at the world, stepped on the sacred lands of Povius. And in the opinion of the Empress, it was too merciful on the part of the sun god to send Horatio to the land of Tesca after such a disgrace, and it was worth getting rid of this demigod immediately. But now, Avarisha said that they should wait for the return of Caligo, who will be able to oppose Horatio and occupy the emperor's throne, inheriting the title of the ruler of the Celestial Empire. Even Kimolo became somehow frightened after the words of the Empress, and he timidly denied that Horatio had already shed enough blood on the orders of the Empress Atarisha. It is because of these endless murders of men and gods that Horatio's light has faded catastrophically and will now become a decisive obstacle to obtaining the imperial throne. Kimolo added that every aristocrat in their Povius Empire knows this truth, and even more so His Majesty the Sun God Sol, so no one expects Horatio to get the throne. But Avarisha shouted in displeasure that this was a complete lie, because Sol had always had a weakness for people. And because of this, he will always be merciful to the demigod in whose veins flows human blood. Kamolo looked carefully at the Empress and asked if she was really afraid that the prophecy would come true, according to which an absolute being would assert its rights over a person who does not burn in the flame, and together they would win the eternal glow. To which the Empress shouted that this was complete nonsense, because every person burns in the fire, and asked why the words of some crooked old man were engraved on stone tablets at all. To which Kamolo delicately remarked that it was this prophecy that freed their hands and allowed them to burn human women at the stake for many centuries. Then the magician carefully took out a box from his pocket. Kimolo handed the Empress a box containing magic pills and said that this would calm her down. And he added that it was thanks to this prophecy that they were able to cast a spell on Prince Horatio. Avarisha put the pill in her mouth and said in a calmer tone that it was this prophecy that helped her finish off that human woman, whose name, if memory serves, was Marthali. It still pained Avarisha to remember the times when the mages had accepted that the prophecy had come true. And Sol treated the human woman and her son Horatio very respectfully and was always by their side. Avarisha had to earn her place on the heavenly Olympus with sweat and blood, And now Horatio reminds her of all the humiliations Avarisha had to go through on her way to the throne. Although Avarisha already had a son from God's soul, the emperor always had an ambiguous attitude towards him, due to the fact that Kaligo inherited rather weak divine abilities. Avarisha looked at Kimolo and said that he was the only one she could boast of for his loyalty and devotion over the years, and he was the only one she could trust completely. The empress then said that this might be their only chance, and that they should definitely try to imprison Horatio in the realm of Hades forever, because there might not be another chance. Avarisha looked at Kimolo and said in a serious tone that it was after they finally got rid of Horatio that their family would once again become the most powerful in the heavenly Olympus. In fact, the empress did everything just so that her son Kaligo finally became the ruler of heaven, and she finally defeated her competitor, the woman who left Horatio behind. Meanwhile, Nika recalled that Lady Radiana had interceded for her before the powerful goddess Ter, who could easily kill the nymph, and demanded that the goddess apologize for her behavior. Therefore, Nika decided that she must do everything in her power to make sure that all the aristocrats of Povius treat Lady Radiana with dignity and respect. Nika, sitting under the bathroom, was lost in guesswork when Horatio and Radiana were already bathing, and the sunny prince and his girlfriend were kissing in the water with a stick at that time. Horatio barely broke away from the passionate kiss and said that Radiana was just incredible, and it was time for them to start getting ready to celebrate the birth of Sol's first grandchild. Horatio only reminded Radiana to be extremely careful and not have time to injure herself until Gino was with her. Then the prince headed for the exit, and Radiana couldn't take her eyes off his bare torso. Horatio advised the girl to be extremely careful from now on, and reminded her that he couldn't wait until they finally got back to Tesca and spent their first night with her. Radiana continued to sit in the water, and the words of the Sun Prince did not leave her thoughts. And when she remembered that kiss, everything inside turned upside down, and the girl became afraid of these feelings. Just then, Gino returned from his mission, and Horatio remarked that he had been in the human world for quite some time. He displeasedly told the prince to speak more quietly so that no one would hear it. Horatio immediately ordered the valet to tell him everything he had learned, and he informed him that Lady Radiana belonged to the family of High Priest Eunuchus and was his illegitimate daughter. The valet asked disgruntled what Horatio was doing in his room, because he was supposed to be enjoying the festival at this time, and his absence would be quite noticeable. But Horatio replied that he did not feel like celebrating now, because his healing powers were almost exhausted. Therefore, the prince has more important things to do than to smile at those aristocrats who have gathered for the celebration. Gino refused to believe it, and said that Horatio was only 200 years old, and if the healing abilities began to disappear at this age, then for God it is a death sentence. Horatio himself perfectly understood that if the immortal lost his healing abilities, then he would forever lose the opportunity to be called the son of the sun god. The valet began to shout that he had warned Horatio long ago to stop killing, because that was what led him to lose his healing magical powers, which the prince thoughtlessly exchanged for bloodshed. Horatio wasn't going to listen to Gino's complaints anymore, so he immediately sent him back down to earth. The valet continued to shout from there that the Sun Prince did not like hearing the truth at all. Gino decided that he could not allow Horatius to kill anymore, and that he should take this personally to the sun god. Meanwhile, 2 young girls approached him and asked what he was doing here. The valet answered that he wanted to chat with High Priest Eunuchus. The girls did not have time to answer where he was, when they heard that the guards shouted loudly for everyone to get out of the way, because the high priest himself was coming. The valet decided that this was a good opportunity to speak with Eunuchus in person, and went out into the street in front of the high priest's guards, who ordered the old man to get away and clear the way. But as soon as the guards exposed their weapons, Gino immediately shouted that it is strictly forbidden to shed blood on the territory of the temple, and asked the high priest if he was telling the truth. The guards looked guiltily at Eunuchus and apologized for any inconvenience, promising to immediately remove this crooked old man from the path of His Highness the High Priest. The valet immediately realized that the guards had decided to get rid of him, and so he took off his hood and turned to Eunuchus, ordering him to come down to him, for he was already tired of raising his head. The guards looked at this madman and asked if he even knew who he was talking to. The valet replied that he was next to the sun god, so he gave himself advice on this. The valet looked the high priest in the eyes and shouted that Eunuchus must have already guessed who he was dealing with if he really was a servant of the sun god. but Eunuchus only raised his hand, signaling the guards to get rid of his grandfather. The valet didn't have time to react when he felt a sharp, cold metal pierce his body, and when Gino's gaze dropped down, he saw the bloodstain begin to grow on his clothes. Gino thought that if the high priest really had spiritual power, then he immediately noticed that the valet had the mark of the sun god and realized that he was not just an old grandfather standing in front of him. All this was closely watched by Horatio, and when he saw this, he angrily said that Gino could not die until he had completed his business to the end, angry that the valet could not cope with a mountain of men. Meanwhile, Nika was helping Radiani to get ready for the social party, and noticed that the hostess was thinking about something and was looking at one point in the mirror. Nika asked why Lady Radiana wasn't talking, and Radiana replied that she was just dreaming about something. The nymph hastened to ask what exactly her mistress was thinking. Then Radiana asked the nymphs if all members of the imperial family really possessed healing powers. The nymph replied that all the deities possess her, and even she has small healing powers. Nika then said that Lady Radiana must be referring to the goddess Thera, and assured her that the cruel woman had healed herself before she entered her own chambers, so she was nothing to worry about. And as long as Horatio didn't kill her, Thera could heal herself as much as she wanted. Radiana then asked Nika what she meant, and the nymph asked in surprise if Radiana did not know about Horatio's ability. The nymph said that only the Sun Prince Horatio has the ability to kill someone, and this applies to absolutely everyone without exception. If Horatio carries out the murder, then the deity has no way to go back. Radiana thought that there was some nonsense in Nika's words, because if Horatio was so strong, then why did he need the healing power of the valet Gino, with the help of which he periodically recovered? Radiana said that she was generally entangled in these divine affairs, and she got the impression that after her appearance everyone had only more problems, especially in the relationship between Horatio and Thera. Radiana was worried that everyone would be in danger because of her. Then the nymph took the lady's hand and said that she should not worry about it, because Radiana herself had already managed to save her from death. Horatio decided to personally deal with the high priest Eunuchus, and immediately went to the ground, standing in front of the procession. A valet lay in a pool of blood on the ground next to the Sun Prince. The guards immediately began to rehearse that a deity had appeared before them. Meanwhile, Horatio asked the man who was sitting in the jeweled carriage if he really was Eunuchus Mundus. The high priest immediately knelt before the Sun Prince and said that Eunuchus Mundus was at his service. And he himself began to think chaotically, what made Horatio personally come here? In Eunuchus's opinion, only the last girl they burned slept, and he immediately guessed that it was because of her. Horatio, meanwhile, said aloud that Eunuchus's latest victim had given him some trouble. Eunuchus said he was very sorry about that, but this girl was the best, and he had put a lot of effort into making her something worthy of sacrifice. Horatio remarked that Eunuchus was not very successful in his scam, but the high priest hastened to justify himself that although Radiana was born as a second-class woman, she still remains his daughter. The words about the second-rate woman made Horatio very angry, so he immediately used solar radiation, which illuminated the entire temple of El Diego and did not allow even to look. Eunuchus clutched at his bleeding eyes and cried out that he could no longer see. And Horatio, meanwhile, said angrily that at last he now understood what kind of father Eunuchus was to Radiana. Horatio exclaims that unfortunately Eunuchus is not worthy of his daughter, so he will have to answer for his actions in the Supreme Court, which will begin immediately for him. Horatio also added that from now on he himself would take care of Radiana. And then the Sun Prince snapped his fingers and brought Gino back to life in an instant. The valet rose to his feet and looked around. Gino still couldn't figure out how people managed to take him so easily, and even more so take his life. Gino began to rehearse, and was angry with himself that he could so easily lose to several people. Horatio only remarked that the valet must be getting old if he behaved so carelessly. And then it came to the valet that they were now on the ground. He asked Horatio what he was doing here, and when he looked around, he saw dead guards lying around a huge gash from the explosion. Gino asked the prince if he had lost his mind at all when he was killing all these people. Horatio countered that if Gino had not been killed before his eyes, he would not have interfered with these events on Earth. The valet began to rehearse that the goddess of fate would definitely tell the sun god Sol about everything that happened here, and Horatio would be unrepentant, especially since his position in the heavenly empire is already quite shaky. But Horatio touched the valet's nose and told him to behave quietly, for they must hasten to bring their greetings for their nephew's birthday. Meanwhile, Saltus approached his wife and advised her to hand over their son to the maids, telling her not to overexert herself. The vicar noted that he was quite protective of her. The vicar held her son in her arms, and smiling at her husband, said that it was not difficult for her to take care of their son, and she only wanted to show their son to the Sun Emperor. Vicaria then said that she had heard that Horatio had brought his first woman to the festival, and Saltus said that after that there was a real uproar, and only a lazy person does not discuss these gossips. Then Vicaria noticed that Saltus had not told her anything about that nymph, and she would like to know what she was like. But the halibut quickly replied that it was not worth talking about that nymph at all. Saltus advised to stay away from that nymph as much as possible. The vicar was surprised by his words, because he constantly said that one should not give up on others, which she reminded him of. Vicaria added that she herself belongs to the Farum family, but their rich relatives do not respect her, considering her family to be less important in the heavenly Olympus. But this did not prevent Saltus from marrying her. The vicar knew very well that Horatio had no friends in heaven, so no one would want to get close to his nymph. And she, like no one else, understood what it was like to be alone among the aristocratic nobility. The maid intervened in the conversation, reminding her that she should start gathering for the celebration of her son's birth, and the vicar replied that she would come now. Saltus was glad that he would not need to continue this spicy conversation and give answers to such controversial questions, so he tenderly kissed his wife and said that he would see him at the banquet. When the man left the room, the vicar asked the maid where the nymph was now staying. The maid said that Radiana stayed in the small rooms on the west side of the palace. The maid said that the nymph Horatio got into a fight with Tara on the very first day of the festival, and after Horatio stood up for her, it further complicated the relationship between the prince and Avaritia. While getting dressed, the vicar was surprised that Horatio stood up for anyone at all and thought that he must have had his reasons for doing so. And the fact that Tara belongs to the Treacherous family only annoyed Horatio, who disliked them. As she walked through the banquet hall, Vicaria kept hearing snippets of gossip that criticized Radiana for appearing at the festival, and some blamed Radiana for living in Magus's cave. Finally, Radiana herself appeared in the banquet hall, accompanied by the faithful nymph Nika. The vicar immediately looked at the woman who had filled the heavenly palace with so much gossip. The vicar immediately realized that the woman she did not know was the first lady of Prince Horatio, so she approached her first and greeted her. Radiana looked at the stranger with surprise. A nymph came to Radiani's aid as usual, who asked Lady Radiani's permission to introduce Prince Saltus's wife to her, Her Highness Vicaria. Now Radiana understood who she was talking to now. Radiana immediately bowed before the goddess and said that it was a great honor for Radiana to meet her. And the vicar, in turn, asked what was the name of Prince Horatio's first wife. Radiana smiled and said her name. The girl also handed Vicar an elegant decoration in the form of a pink lily and said that she had a gift for Her Highness. The vicar was very surprised at such a delicate work, because she had not seen anything like it for a long time. So she timidly asked if Radian had made this ornament herself. Radiana was embarrassed and did not know what to answer, and Nika said that Lady Radiana had been studying with Mr. Magus for several months, so she can now make such precious jewelry. The vicar could not look away from such an incredible work, and remarked that the jewelry made by Radiana is of very high quality, and she will be happy to wear this gift. Meanwhile, Saltus saw that his wife was talking to Radiana and called her. The vicar apologized for having to leave Radiana and promised to talk to her later. When Vicaria approached her husband, she showed him an exquisite handmade gift and said that Radiana can create simply incredible miracles. Saltus wanted to warn the Vicaria again to stay away from Radiana, but Horatio intervened in the conversation, who also greeted Her Highness the Vicaria, so Saltus did not finish what he wanted. The vicar, with a smile on her face, remarked that she had been waiting a long time for his congratulations, because she thought that Horatio would be the first to congratulate them on the birth of their firstborn. The prince apologized, saying that there were urgent matters. The vicar was in a good mood and showed Horatio the jewelry that Radiana had given him, praising that the prince's first wife had very good taste. He was only surprised when Radiana managed to do it. It was solemnly announced to the entire banquet hall that His Highness the Sun God had arrived for the celebration that was being held in honor of Vicaria and Saltus. Sol, meanwhile, raised a glass of wine for the health of his grandson. Avaritia stood next to Sol and Prince Horatio met her eyes. He immediately understood that something was wrong here, because the Empress had never looked at him so kindly. So Horatio hastened to deal with this matter. But before he had time to take a couple of steps, he was approached by the vicar, who said that she had a personal request for Horatio. When Horatio inquired what Vicaria wanted from him, the goddess asked for permission to meet with Radiana alone, because they did not have time to agree, and Vicaria would like to be friends with this nymph. Horatio looked for his Radiana with his eyes, and saw that she was standing aside with Nika. The well-dressed girl looked somehow special today, and was looking for the prince with her eyes, waiting for him to approach her. Horatio then looked at Vicaria and said that a meeting with Radiana would be impossible. Surprised, the vicar asked why, because friendship with the princess would not hinder her at all now. Horatio tactfully kissed Vicaria's hand and said that Radiani didn't need friends at the moment. In his mind, the prince said that his beauty should belong only to him. Horatio said he had urgent business, so he apologized for having to leave the banquet. Heading for the exit, he looked for Avarisha with his eyes, because her behavior seemed rather strange to him. Meanwhile, Kamolo and Avarisha, wearing dark cloaks, made their way to the secret place. Avarisha asked if the mage had managed to come up with something with today's banquet, so that no one would notice her absence. Kimolo said that the girl who will play the role of Empress today was ordered to stay until the end of the banquet. And besides, she was provided with rhinum so that no one could read her thoughts. Finally, they reached the magic door. When Kimolo touched them with his hand, glowing symbols suddenly appeared on them, and the magician whispered them. After that, the door finally opened. Avataria noted that His Highness took great care of safety equipment, and almost no one could pass such complex magical obstacles. So she was glad that they managed to do it. The Empress became very interested in what the Emperor wanted to hide so carefully. And when they reached the table on which the casket stood, Kimolo inquired whether Avarisha had taken what they had agreed upon. Avarisha replied that of course she had managed to bring Sol Lumen's personal item and held out a handkerchief on which lay the sun god's carefully cut hair. After making sure that they had the sun god's personal thing, Kimolo began to recite the spell. His words, like thunder, bounced off the walls and echoed throughout the cave, which even made it somehow creepy. During this ritual, signs of aging appeared on Kimolo's face, and Avarisha even shuddered in horror. And then some black energy appeared above the chest, and Kimolo shouted that the right time had come. Avarisha immediately understood what the magician was talking about and threw her hair on the piggy bank. After that, the black energy, having connected with the hair of the sun god, became even larger, and an explosion occurred. But when the smoke cleared, Avarisha noticed that the treasure chest was already without a lock, and therefore the Empress was able to open it with ease. The joys of the Empress knew no bounds, because she did not expect that they would succeed in this adventure. When the casket was opened, Avarisha saw that a handkerchief with blood was lying on its bottom, and since the blood was red, it meant that it could only belong to a person. Horatio followed a woman who was at the party and tried to pass herself off as Avarisha. So when the feast was over, she made her way through the imperial garden to her chambers. At that moment, Horatio thought about where the real Avarisha actually was, and his guesses made him uneasy, because she was clearly not resting in her chambers like this time. Horatio then noticed several men dressed in black cloaks emerge from the thicket, and he thought they must be Avarisha's minions, sent by her to take care of the doppelganger. The men immediately surrounded the woman, who looked like 2 drops of water to Avarisha, and the frightened woman began to scream for help. But the woman did not have time to say a few words, as the men, using magical energy, directed their blow directly at the woman. After that, her body scattered on the ashes that covered the grass on the lawn. Horatio thought that this was to be expected, because the Empress always got rid of those who no longer benefited her. Therefore, he was convinced that Avarisha was up to something. The prince pondered how he should approach Avarisha to find out about her plans, and accidentally overheard the conversation of Nika, who was asking Radiana why she left the banquet so quickly. Nika tried to reassure Radiani that she should have stayed there until the very end. But Radiana sadly replied that Nika herself had to understand that she did not belong there, so she decided to go to her room. Radiana thought that it would be easy for her to pretend to be the prince's lover, but she could no longer bear the fact that all the gods mocked her. Therefore, the girl hurried to leave the festive dinner. Nika wanted to somehow support her mistress, and reminded her that Her Highness the Vicar really liked the gift that Radiana had made for her, and the goddess liked to communicate with Radiana. But Radiana only replied that Vicaria would not be so kind to her if she found out that in fact Radiana is not a nymph at all, but an ordinary human slave. Gino suddenly appeared in front of the girls, who fell to the floor with almost no sign of life. The girls immediately ran up to him, and Radiana asked the valet what happened. Radiana immediately invited him to go to her rooms so that she could take care of him, and asked where he got such wounds and why he did not heal himself. The girl added that he must have fought a dragon. Gino thought that it would be better if it was a dragon, then he could tell about it, so he just shouted for Nika to bring him water immediately. But the nymph also wondered why he did not heal himself. Gino began to repeat that he was thrown here with the rays of the first sun, and all his bones are broken, and it is not about some small scratches that are so easily healed. But Nika noted that the fractures did not affect his talkativeness in any way. Radiana asked Nika to stop joking, because Gino is in a lot of pain. Horatio thought at that moment that Gino was in pain because of the resurrection. Horatio envied that it wasn't Gino that the girls were making such a fuss about, and thought that Radiana had never looked at him with such sympathetic eyes as at this valet, for which he began to be angry with him. The man on the ship decided to open Electus and hurried to fulfill Caligo's order, but he immediately started shouting that they had finally figured out who they were dealing with and that he was waiting for their apologies. Electus looked with a wicked smile at the man who entered his cell and said that they should just wait until he had a hand free, and then he would immediately cut off everyone's heads. But the man who removed the shackles from the hands of Electus told him to close the boat, because no one should say such words when the divine being is on the ship. But Electus only laughed at these words, and going to the deck, cried out, asking who here had the courage to pretend to be the sun god. After all, Electus himself wants to deal with this. Caligo got up from the table and turned to the brat who had just entered. The Sun Prince asked if his father was really Unicus Mundus, the high priest of the El Diego Empire. Coming closer to Electus, Caligo said that his father must not have taught him anything, since the man would dare to show such insolence in the presence of the Sun Prince. Caligo added that the man is not even worthy of worshipping the sun's rays. Electus immediately fell to his knees and began to apologize for his behavior and the words he had said without thinking. Caligo looked at the man kneeling in front of him and wondered how he should punish this brat for blasphemy. Caligo liked to amuse himself with mortals in this way. When the first sun arrow touched Electus's body, he began to rehearse even more that he would do anything if only the Sun Prince would spare his life. So Caligo arrogantly replied that there was no need for this, because Electus had already disappointed him, and, preparing for the fatal blow, he heard someone calling him. Caligo guessed that his mother, Avaricia, was addressing him and asked her what happened. She told her son that she had sensational news for him, and when Caligo asked her not to delay, but to speak sooner, she reported that Horatio's first wife was a human. Caligo asked in surprise if she was the girl from the prophecy. The Empress only laughed at his words and replied that, of course not, because Sol would have killed her long ago in such a case. Avaricia said that Horatio must have decided to amuse himself in this way. Finally, the Empress added that very soon the star time of Caligo himself, who should occupy the imperial throne and become the heir to the heavenly Olympus, will come. Already in her room after the banquet, the vicar was happy that they had managed to celebrate the birth of their baby in a grand manner and hoped that the imperial family had been replenished with a worthy heir. She and her husband discussed that their baby would probably be the rowdiest of all Godsol's grandchildren. When the maid decided to take the jewelry that Radiana had given her, the vicar asked her to keep it. The vicar told Saltus that previously only Mr. Magus could make jewelry of this quality, so she is very pleased that he has passed on such a rare skill to someone. The vicar recalled that since childhood, Horatio had a weakness for beauty, about which he constantly received remarks from his mentors, and added that this was probably why he chose this nymph. Then Vicaria added with a smile that she still resented Horatio for not allowing her to speak to Radiana, though she was sure they would have been good friends. Saltus never hid anything from his wife, so he decided not to keep this secret to himself, and admitted to Vicaria that in fact Radiana was not a nymph at all, but an ordinary person. The vicar just blinked and did not want to believe these words. She exclaimed that the sun god would have intervened immediately if this was actually true. Saluz regretfully admitted that he had no idea what his father was thinking about now, but that Radiana was human, he had no doubts, because Horatio himself had told him about it. Then the vicar said that it is possible that this woman is the woman from the prophecy. And Saltus replied that he did not think so, because in such a case, the father would definitely interfere in this and not leave this choice just like that. Saltus thought that Horatio had specifically chosen a human as his first wife to provoke Her Highness Avaritia and Caligo. The vicar could not believe it and asked if the man was sure about it. Saltus said that soon Her Highness will find out about it herself because she secretly went to Caladium today with Camolo, and most likely she already has all the information. The Caladium was a high tower, the entrance to which was carefully sealed with the help of magic, and no one but the Godsoul could enter there. Therefore, one could only guess why Avaritia went there. Halibut thought that the Empress they had seen at the banquet today was just a fake, and when he thought what the Empress was up to, he felt sick. His thoughts were interrupted by his frightened wife, who asked Saltus what Horatio was going to do now and whether he had decided to declare war on the Empress and her son. The vicar said they had to stop it, but Saltus admitted that he would not be able to solve this issue on his own. The vicar, with tears in her eyes, said she wanted their son to grow up in peacetime. Saltus admitted that Horatio had already made up his mind and was not going to change it. Then the vicar offered to meet with Radiana and talk to her about it, but Saltus was against it. The vicar refused to obey him and shouted that she was not going to sit idly by and must try to stop this senseless massacre before it started. Meanwhile, Avaritia tried to regain her beauty and strength after visiting the Collegium, because staying there took a lot of energy and only Renum could help her in this. The Empress reported that Lady Tara had already arrived at her room, and Avaritia told them to bring her niece inside immediately. After examining the girl, she admitted that she looked pretty bad. Avaritia said out loud that Tara looked terrible, and the future princess of the Tezca Empire should be careful with her outfits. Tara couldn't believe her ears and asked her aunt if she was going to take her back. Avaritia replied that she is not as cruel as people think. Avaritia then said that Tara was right, and Horatio had indeed brought a man to the heavenly Olympus. And since this information was quite valuable, the Empress was going to thank Terry for it. Tara, with tears in her eyes, thanked the Empress for her generosity. Avaritia, meanwhile, came up to Tara, took her face in her hands, and told her that she, her aunt, should take care of her niece. And then the Empress unexpectedly added that Tara should immediately apologize to that nymph, and moreover, establish friendly relations with her as soon as possible. Tara grumpily replied that a certain Empress had messed something up because she wasn't going to mess with that stupid nymph. Then the Empress, in a sterner tone, asked if she refused. Avaritia said that she has to carry out the plan, and no one will stand in her way. Therefore, Tara should be friends with Radiana, so that this girl will be under their supervision. Tara didn't understand why she would do that, but the Empress told her to just do what Avaritia told her. Tara decided not to argue with her aunt, especially since she had only recently been forgiven. Avarithia, meanwhile, said that they should wait for Caligo to return to heaven, and then she would tell Tara what to do next. Horatio came to Radiana's room and approached the girl. She could not understand what had happened, so she asked Horatio what she had done wrong, if she had made a mistake somewhere. But the Sunny Prince only mysteriously answered that Radiana did everything right. Radiana already knew the Sun Prince quite well, and understood that his infusion was significantly different from the usual one. Then the young girl decided to ask directly what had happened, because a few minutes ago, Horatio had put the valet Gino and Nika outside the door, because Horatio could not do this without reason. Then Horatio fell to the knees of his Radiana, and she cried out in surprise. Then the Sun Prince gently said that he would like Radiana to take such gentle care of him as well.